Soundings Audiobooks presents an unabridged recording of A Flag of Truce, written by David Donachie, read by Peter Wickham. The moral right of the author has been asserted. This performance is owned by Soundings, Whitley Bay, NE 26, 2JT. Chapter 1. John Pearce, standing on the quarterdeck of HMS Weasel, could see the faint outline of Montferrand rising over 2,000 feet behind the port of Toulon, but it was, despite the best efforts of Nîmes, the ship's master, coming no closer. A tramontane howling down from the Alps into the Gulf of Lion meant it was impossible to make any headway going north-northeast, and that was before it had acted upon the sea to turn this part of the Mediterranean into a maelstrom of wind-whipped water. The oilskins he was wearing were supposed to keep him dry, but every time a wave broke over the bows, sending back a cascade of furious white spume, it seemed at least a gallon found its way into those gaps between skin and garment, so that his clothes beneath were as wet as if he had been clad in them alone, and some of the salt had soaked the bandage on his arm, where a musket ball had grazed it, making the wound sting like the devil. His presence on the deck was purely for show. John Pearce might be a lieutenant in King George's Navy, and in temporary command of the ship, but he knew he was not fit to be in charge of a vessel in this kind of weather. He lacked the necessary experience, having come by his rank through a royal command, rather than the years of experience normally required to pass for his position. But given such a hearty blow, and the fact that there was some slight risk to the ship, he felt it necessary to adopt the position a proper captain would occupy. On deck, getting soaked, looking keenly ahead through salt-encrusted eyes, giving an impression of magisterial calm and an utter confidence that was totally at odds with his true feelings. Occasionally, as also befitted his station, he would glance over to see how his consort, under the command of the young midshipman, Mr. Harbin, was faring. The Mariette, captured after a hot action in a Corsican bay, was ploughing into the seas with as little effect as his own vessel, and the sight of her rearing and bucking, the tip of her bowsprit hitting wave after wave, the surge of the water from each coursing along her decks, was a mirror image of what was happening beneath his own widely spread feet. From her side a steady jet of water was blown asunder, as the men below worked the pumps to discharge that which no amount of tarpaulins stretched tight across hatches could keep out. Likewise the close-reefed topsails mirrored that above his head, with just a scrap of sail showing on both main and jib to allow the ship to hold itself into the gale. "It be a bugger, this wind!" yelled Nîmes, his mouth pressed close to the gap between the foul-weather hat and John Pearce's ear. "Can last for days, can a tramontane, and at its worst many a ship has foundered." The temptation to respond with an ironic "Thank you for that" died on Pearce's lips. Nîmes he had to trust, he being the best man aboard to keep him and his crew from perdition, the man who could get them safely to the snug anchorage below that ring of mountains he saw ahead, one that Nîmes had informed him was impervious to the wind they were facing, and only at risk from a really heavy Levanta. Levanta, Mistral, Sirocco, Tramontane. These had, only months before, been words of mystery to John Pearce. North, south, east, and west winds that, and he struggled from time to time to remember which was which, had come to dominate his thinking. When he was not concerned with the possibility of taking the vessel, a command he had inherited along with their recent capture, into battle. Above his head there was a man lashed to the mainmast cap, swaying through an arc of some 30 feet, eyes peeled on the disturbed horizon for any sign of an enemy vessel. Safety lay ahead, with the British fleet laying in the roadstead off Toulon. Lord Hood, the C&C, had taken over the town and harbour, as well as the French fleet, with the active connivance of the majority of the citizenry and leading elements of the French navy. But that did not mean here, in the offing, some unknown enemy might not lurk. A frigate, perhaps, keeping watch, for there were known to be several enemy warships that had been at sea when Toulon surrendered. Seeing two vessels of a much lighter draught, one of them with the British ensign flying above a tricolour, evidence of a taken prize, they could perhaps risk an opportunity to make an easy capture. "All hands to wear ship!" shouted Neame, his trumpet aimed at the sodden companionway that led below. It was an unenthusiastic crew that tumbled up onto the deck, but they went to their stations without orders as Neame yelled once more in his commanding officer's ear, "I feel an easing, sir." Pearce was startled and surprised, but he nodded in what he considered the required fashion. If Neame had detected something he had signally failed to interpret, he was not about to argue with him. Yet was he right? Was the screaming note as the wind whistled through the rigging just a little less oppressive? His mind had wandered, his concentration slipped, and Pearce silently cursed himself for it. He had been thinking of what lay ahead, of the revenge he would take on Ralph Barclay, a man he considered a bitter enemy, rather than what was happening here and now. A lack of concentration was something which no end of people had told him could be fatal, the sea being an unforgiving element for a mind not focused. "Lord Hood wishes HMS Brilliant to be kept in the inner harbour, Captain Barclay. That is all I can tell you." Vice Admiral Sir William Hotham helped himself to a slice of melon from the plate before him, a handkerchief at the ready to catch the juice which escaped from the corner of his mouth. The whole act of eating such a ripe piece of fruit made more risky by the way HMS Britannia, despite her twin anchors and the protection of the mountains which cut off the worst of the wind, was pitching and rolling on a heavy sea. Ralph Barclay, in hearing what had just been said, was incensed, but it would never do to show any dissent to a man on whom he depended for so much. "I am obliged to ask, sir, what purpose can a frigate serve in such a situation?" "We cannot—" Hotham paused and wiped his lips. "We cannot get one of our own capital ships into the inner harbour. It would smack to our recently acquired allies of distrust." "Well-placed distrust, sir, if I may say." Hotham nodded and forked another piece of melon, which he held away from him as he answered. "I agree. The French are our allies only in so long as it suits their purpose. A swing in the wind of their damned revolution and we will be fighting them again." "It would have been best, sir, to have seized every one of their ships. Never mind that they raised a royal standard." It had been a shrewd ploy by Baron d'Ambert, the most active senior officer of the French fleet, once negotiations to take over the port had been concluded, to raise the royal standard, the Bourbon fleur-de-lis, thus claiming to be fighting the revolution, supporting the true, if displaced, government of France. Hotham frowned and waved his fruit on the end of his fork. "I fear Lord Hood's promise to hold them in trust for a Bourbon restoration places us in restraint. We cannot seize vessels that we acknowledge are the property of others." "Perhaps," Ralph Barclay essayed, in a voice lacking certainty, "Lord Hood allowed sentiment to cloud his judgment." Ralph Barclay considered the care he was exercising well placed. Hotham and Hood did not get on. In fact, they saw eye to eye on practically nothing. But that did not mean that a mere frigate captain could damn one admiral in the presence of another, men of such rank being a fickle and touchy bunch. Hotham shook his head slowly, in that way which denoted a lack of firm opinion. "It can only be that, for it is certainly not in the interests of the Navy or our country. Yet it may be that he has seen his error, not admitted it, you understand, but seen it, and he had decided to take some necessary precautions." The melon disappeared, which necessitated a pause while it was consumed. "We have, in HMS Brilliant, the only armed vessel in a position to dominate the Ministry of the Marine, the French arsenal, and the better sections of the town. The wealthy citizens of the Quartier Saint-Roch will not wish to see their properties demolished by cannon fire, which may do more to cement their loyalties to us than the armies besieging the port. Likewise any sign of plotting in the French naval headquarters, and we can reduce it to rubble." Ralph Barclay paid great attention to what had just been said, dissecting it for any sign of censure. His frigate was in that inner harbour because it had been captured prior to the arrival of the main fleet, though Hotham had defended him stoutly for that, in the face of a senior officer who felt that the captain of HMS Brilliant had acted in a rash manner. Then, of course, there was the other matter. "Does this have anything to do, sir, with those base allegations made against me by that upstart Pearce?" Another piece of melon made it to Hotham's mouth, and it was with a rather moist tone that Hotham replied, "I see you do not grace him with his rank. Given that both he and his rank are an abomination, I cannot bring myself to do so, even if it was awarded at the King's pleasure. And the fact Lord Hood saw fit to trust him with an important mission when it came to taking over the port beggars belief." The wipe with the handkerchief that followed was swift and irate. Hotham had somehow been reminded of his own position as second-in-command to a man who made it plain he had scant regards for his abilities, who had not bothered to keep him fully informed of his negotiations with the French Navy and the citizenry of Toulon, or that he had sent a French-speaking emissary ashore. Indeed, at the height of those talks, a lowly creature like John Pearce, Hood's representative, had been more au fait with things than he had himself. "Lord Hood may have other reasons for the orders I have just relayed regarding your ship, but as you know, Captain Barclay, he does not always grace me with the inner workings of his mind." "I am forced to inquire, sir, has he pronounced on this ridiculous notion of my facing a court-martial?" The silence that followed played hard on Ralph Barclay's nerves. Could Hotham be toying with him? The man was famous for taking his time in making any statement, even slower in decision, which made risible his nickname of Hotspur. Also, there was the worry about the balance of their relationship. Hotham had been in receipt of certain favours from the man before him, and in return had given an assurance, though nothing was ever openly stated, that in future he would see Captain Ralph Barclay, given his previous patron was dead, as a supporter of his flag and position. Such a thing was very necessary to both men. No admiral could count himself a success without a number of officers committed to his flag. In turn, the admiral would see to it that these men were rewarded with opportunities or commands. As C&C, that was relatively easy. As a subordinate admiral, it was much harder. Lord Hood held all the cards in this command when it came to advancement. Officers like Elphinstone, Nelson, and Lindsay, clients of Hood, had already been favoured. Hotham would get enough scraps to hand to his client officers to keep him from open complaint, but nothing substantial would come his way as long as Hood held the whip-hand. "My inquiry on that score at our last meeting was tentative, Barclay, but I fear that Hood is inclined to accede to Pearce's demand." The lie that followed, and the calm way in which it was expressed, took some effort, but it came out well enough. "Then I shall just have to face it, sir, with a clear conscience. What can I possibly have to be concerned about? But I fear the strain upon poor Mrs. Barclay." Hotham spoke quickly for once, interrupting. "Damn me, Barclay, I did not ask after your wife. Remiss of me. How is the good lady?" "Toiling away at the hospital, sir. Saint that she is." "Saint indeed," replied Hotham, though the wistful look in his eye had nothing to do with sainthood. Emily Barclay was a beauty, 20 years her husband's junior. There was not an officer in the fleet of any rank or age who did not harbour thoughts regarding her. Not that anyone would do or say anything that could be construed as dalliance. Codes of behaviour were strict in that regard. "Do pass on my compliments," said Hotham, "and assure her that I will speak again with Lord Hood on the matter." Neame was right. The wind had eased, although it was still dead foul in its reduced state, but at least both sloops could tack and wear, making slow but discernible progress towards the southern coast of France. A couple of miles offshore there came, carried on that wind, the first dull thuds of gunfire, land-based cannon fire echoing off the hills, which denoted an artillery duel going on inland. "The rabble has obviously arrived, sir," called Neame, oilskin hat now off, showing soaking wet grey hair above a ruddy, weather-beaten but healthy complexion. Pearce had likewise removed his hat, and opened the top of his coat to remove his dripping comforter. "Don't underestimate that rabble, Mr. Neame. Atcham and Valmy, the same sort of revolutionary mass sent packing the cream of Europe's armies." Hard to recall now he had been in Paris when he heard news of those two famous victories for the citizen armies of France, and he could not now remember if he had been pleased or upset, still a partisan of the French Revolution, or already, like his father, prey to doubts. What he did recollect was the way the falling spirit of the Revolution had been lifted by the news, giving the people of France a feeling that they were on a worthy crusade to free the continent from tyranny, and vaguely he felt certain he had shared in that. Euphoria had not lasted. The September massacres and the beheading of King Louis had soured any feelings of support. Now, following on from the manner of his father's death, he saw the revolution as a deadly disease that must be contained and eventually defeated, though not with a restoration of monarchy. "Beats me how they did it, sir," Neame said, bringing him sharply back to the present. "Happen they'd had a stiffening of good old British redcoats. It would have been John Crapo on the run, not the Duke of Brunswick." "The world turned upside down, Mr. Neame." The older man looked less than pleased at that remark, which was a reminder of the tune played by those British redcoats who had surrendered to the Americans at Yorktown. But Pearce had not meant it that way. For him, these last 4 years since the Revolution of '89 had been a world turned upside down, so much overturned and turned again and again that he was here on this deck in the middle of the Mediterranean, pretending to be a naval officer. "I think I shall take the con, Mr. Neame." The doubt was fleeting as the master responded, and he had a good look at the diminishing sea state before he did so. "As you wish, sir." The speaking trumpet was handed over, and he yelled through it, "All hands on deck!" Pearce was pleased with the speed his voice engendered. Once more the crew came tumbling up from below and ran to their stations, as Pearce, knowing that Neame was watching him like a hawk, picked his moment when HMS Weasel began to sink into a trough, easing the pressure of the wind on the hull and upperworks. "Let fly the sheets!" The men on the falls who had taken the strain began to ease those as the marline spikes were pulled from their holes. On the larboard side, the other party of seamen were hauling hard on a yard that was under pressure from the wind, but haul they did, until the leading edge to starboard passed the eye. So had the bows, and as the ship rose on the swell, the wind hitting them aided the movement, the appropriate command was issued. "Quartermaster, bring us round onto the larboard tack!" Beside him the wheel was swung, not without effort, the rudder biting into the sea and, now aided by the still potent tramontane, completing the travel of the bowsprit from well left of Mount Faron, across the head of the Grande Rade of Toulon, until it was shaping for the eastern limit of the mountains that backed the port. "Sheet home!" came the command, and the falls of both sides were lashed off, with the yards braced right round, holding in place the sails that would inch the ship forward. "Neatly done, sir," said Neame. Looking over, he saw that Midshipman Harbin had performed the same manoeuvre and was still on a parallel course. The youngster would be watching his consort's deck with a keen eye. Whatever Weasel did, he would do likewise, until ordered otherwise. "I think it has eased enough for the cook to get his coppers lit, Mr. Neame." "It has, sir." "Do we need to signal Mr. Harbin?" "He will issue like orders as soon as he sees the smoke from our galley chimney." I don't know about you, Mr. Neame, but I would much appreciate some warm food and dry clothing. And since we are near to port, we might indulge ourselves, if you and our purser will join me for dinner, by finishing off the last of that Hermitage I fetched aboard. A pity such a heavy sea does not permit us to ask Mr. Harbin yonder to join us." "Poor lad," said Neame, without conviction. "HMS Weasel has made her number, sir," said the midshipman sent from the quarterdeck of HMS Victory with the message, "and she has in her possession a prize." "Has she, by God!" exclaimed Admiral Lord Hood, his heavy grey eyebrows shooting up and his prominent nose following. "If he has, then I think that Captain Benton has disobeyed his quite specific orders."
"That is the other thing, sir. The officer of the watch made it my duty to tell you that her own ensign is upside down."
"Benton dead, then?"
"He fears so, sir, though he had no knowledge of who is in command."
"Signal to HMS Weasel. Captain to repair aboard immediately."
"Sir." The lookout on HMS Victory was not the only one to see that prize, and the sight of their own navy's flag flying above that of the enemy, and a signal that a master and commander was dead, probably killed in action, set any number of hearts racing. It had every lieutenant in the fleet who was not ashore and unaware, looking to their seniority and their relationship to Lord Hood. There was nothing callous about this. It was the way of things. War brought death as well as the chance of glory, and advancement in King George's navy, unless an officer had impeccable connections, generally came through one or the other. Of course they would mourn for a dead comrade, that was only fitting, but his demise meant promotion for someone to fill his place, and that would ripple down through the fleet, affecting dozens of officers who would move up a place. It caused as much excitement below decks on the 74-gun warship HMS Leander as the news filtered down. Yet there was anxiety, too. The fact that the captain was dead did not mean that others had been spared the same fate. Common seamen went on deck as little as possible, especially in a strong, clothes-tugging wind that chilled even on a September day, so it was rare to see such figures as Michael O'Hagan, Charlie Taverner, Rufus Dommett, and old leathery-faced Latimer leaning over the rail peering at the incoming vessels. If John Pearce had known his friends were so arrayed, he would have abandoned his dinner, as well as his Hermitage wine, and gone on deck to wave. But he did not do so until the message came that the flag had made his number, and he was summoned aboard.
"A bad idea, sir," said an even ruddier-faced Neame, "to appear before Lord Hood with too much drink in your belly."
John Pearce smiled as he rose to gather his dispatches and put on his best and dry uniform coat. "I take that as a hint, Mr. Neame, that you and Mr. Ottershaw should finish that bottle, around which neck you have your horny sailor's hand." The purser, Ottershaw, slurred slightly in response.
"Would not want it to go to waste, Your Honour, it being such a pretty drop. Not the least trouble, it seems to me, by being shaken all about before the cork was drawn."
"You do not think to keep a drop for young Harbin?"
"It might not hold its true flavour," Neame insisted. "Be my guest, both of you. I shall treat Harbin to a capital dinner if a besieged Toulon will run to such a thing." "Rufus," said Michael O'Hagan, "clamber up them there shrouds and see what's what."
"Why me?" demanded Rufus.
"Sure did I not say please, boyo? What with you being the lightest and most nimble?"
The words might be polite, even close to jocular, but the tone was less so, and Rufus Dommett, faced with the muscular bulk of his Irish messmate, was quick to move. With HMS Victory laying inshore of the anchored 74, they saw John Pearce come on deck, hat in hand, as both of the smaller warships sailed slowly by. The cheer that greeted him was spontaneous, and not to be outdone, all the ships within the roadstead took it up. Pearce looked over to the rail of HMS Leander, and sighting the agitated figures waved to his companions. The world turned upside down right enough, he thought. 3 of those on that deck were the men with whom he had been pressed into the navy, the men he had sworn to get free.
"Belay that damn noise!"
"Get down, Rufus, quick!" hissed Charlie Taverner, himself letting go of the hammock nettings and dropping back onto the deck. Michael O'Hagan did likewise, while Latimer, much older, his lined face a mask of worry, had to ease himself down.
"What in the name of the Lord Almighty do you think you're about?"
"We's cheering in the taking of a prize, sir," said Rufus, too innocent to know that saying nothing was best when dealing with Lieutenant Taberley.
"Silence, damn you!"
Taberley yelled, before turning round and shouting at a midshipman who had been part of the watch.
"You, sir! How can you stand to witness such behaviour?"
He eased himself up onto the hammock nettings and looked out to see John Pearce in plain view, and it took only seconds for Taberley to realise that the swine was actually in command of both vessels, the dispatch case in his hand finishing off the image. On the other ships they were still cheering, which made his blood boil. That a charlatan like Pearce, with whom he had exchanged words already, should receive such accolades was intolerable. Very well, those aboard this ship he had dared to name as his friends would pay.
"You, sir!"
he yelled at the midshipman again,
"are a disgrace to your coat. You cannot control the men."
"With respect, sir, they're not on watch."
"Not on watch, sir? They're not fit to be on watch, just as they're not to be trusted to be set ashore without they would run. But they are fit to be punished, sir. Take their names and let us see them at defaulters tomorrow. Then, with luck, they will taste at the grating. Let us see, sir, how keen they are to cheer then."
John Pearce was still looking at the side of the ship, wondering why his companions in misfortune had disappeared so quickly. But that thought had to be put aside as Neame, slightly drunk but still competent, let fly the sheets and, rudder hard down, brought the ship in a wide sweep to rest under the bulk of HMS Victory. He then ordered the boat lowered that would take his acting captain aboard the flagship. Chapter 2. Standing on the quarterdeck of HMS Victory, waiting to be summoned below, Pearce looked inland to the shore and beyond, the sound of continuous cannon fire louder now. There was fighting going on around Ollioules at the head of the valley, which provided the western gateway by which the port and town could be invested. There was another to the east, narrower and more difficult, but it was Montferrand and its companion hills, studded with forts now being reinforced by hastily built redoubts, which provided the main defence to landward. Below the ring of hills lay the town, an old and jumbled mass of narrow alleys around the outer harbour, more up-to-date past the Vauban-designed fortifications, a star-shaped moated bastion. Beyond that lay the newest buildings, which had housed the hub of a formidable part of what had been the Marine Royale, the arsenal, and the fleet commander's headquarters. Toulon had fallen, first to revolutionary fervour, and secondly to fear. Again his mind went back to Paris, to the certainty of that place 2 years before, after the Battle of Valmy, the centre and driving force of all that had happened in France. No doubt existed in most Gallic minds regarding the rightness of the '89 revolution. The destruction of the Bastille had been an event waiting to happen in a bankrupt nation stuck in an outmoded monarchical system that saw the rich prosper while the poor starved. That it had been humbled was now seen as inevitable, though Pearce suspected few were so certain of the outcome at the time. What had happened since created enclaves like Toulon, where the citizens saw the strictures and actions of radical Parisian-based politicians in a less acquiescent way. In the capital, factions fought for control and sought to outdo each other in the purity of their revolutionary ideals, using the mob to ratchet up the tone of revolution. Yet even at the epicentre, many a mind was sceptical of the direction in which events were moving. Worse, it had become impossible to object. To do so risked at best incarceration, the fate of his own father who had spoken out against excess. At worst, the guillotine, the ultimate fate from which his son had been unable to rescue him.
In the countryside, the actions of politicians constantly driven on by the excessive demands of a Paris mob were viewed with alarm. Worse still, the penalties deemed necessary to keep the revolution alive. Having got rid of a monarchical tyranny, the majority of Frenchmen, especially those of some educational property, were not keen to see the power of the Paris radicals extended to replace it. Lyon, the second city of France, was in full-scale revolt, and there were rumours of a priest-led war going on in the Vendée. Marseille, too, had risen, and had tried to act in concert with Toulon. They had even invited Lord Hood and his fleet to take over the protection of the city, but he had deemed it indefensible. The great port had fallen only weeks before, and the exactions of a revolutionary revenge had begun as soon as it was captured. Rape, murder, both judicial and spontaneous, robbery and arson, all the trials that since time immemorial had been the fate of a city under sack. Toulon, fearing a similar fate, had asked for protection, and Hood, because of its topography, easier to defend, had obliged, and the task now was to hold the place. Pearce, before he left on his cruise, had heard both opinions advanced. That Toulon was impregnable, as well as the opposite. It could not be held without an army the defenders did not have. He had no idea who was right and who was wrong, lacking as he did the knowledge to make a judgment. "Lieutenant Pearce!" He turned round to face Capitaine de Vaisseau, le Baron d'Ambert, an English-speaking French officer he had come to know well in the period leading up to the British takeover. Pearce had been Hood's emissary in the delicate negotiations, a reluctant one, certainly, but left little choice, being in need of the Admiral's support in his dispute with Ralph Barclay. The French captain had been instrumental in bringing about the surrender of town, forts, and fleet. No man could claim more than he, given that his superior, Rear Admiral Trogoff, had vacillated mightily, avoiding decisions with a cunning that, had it been applied at sea and in battle, would have been hailed as genius. "Aye, here I am to congratulate you," said d'Ambert, his weary eyes sad. Hardly surprising. He was a French officer, and HMS Weasel had taken a French ship. "Good fortune, sir, rather than competence, and not without loss." "Ah, yes, your captain." Pearce didn't want to talk about Benton, the man he had been obliged to replace, who had died right in front of him. He might have been a drunk for most of the voyage, and damned rude with it, but he had shown real pluck in the decision to disobey his orders, which were to merely reconnoitre the Corsican anchorages and stay away from trouble. Had he lived, he would have come aboard instead of John Pearce, no doubt in anticipation of a fitting reward for his bravery and application. As it was, Benton was in a canvas sack at the bottom of the Mediterranean, with a cannonball at his feet. Food, eventually, for the crabs. "How are relations with Admiral Hood, sir?" D'Ambert produced a wan smile. "They are those of a junior officer, Lieutenant." Seeing that Pearce did not comprehend, he added, "Rear Admiral Trogoff has seen it as his duty to take the task of dealing with your Admiral upon himself." There was a terrible temptation to say, "He has a damned cheek." Trogoff had done everything he could to avoid making a decision regarding the state of matters in the town, had failed utterly to control his junior admiral, a dyed-in-the-wool revolutionary called Saint-Julien, and managed to absent himself when finally it came time to act. Indeed, he had even stated his intention to escape via Italy with a view to joining the royal émigré and the anti-French coalition armies under the late King Louis's brother, le Comte d'Artois, at Coblentz, only failing to do so because there was a ragtag French army on the Italian border blocking his way. "Naturally," d'Ambert added, "when Admiral de Trogoff needs my advice and my ability to translate, as he does on a day like today, I am summoned." "So I surmise today we have a difficulty," Pearce said. "You will recall our problem with the sailors who supported Saint-Julien."
I suspect from your tone they are still a problem.
They are. Most of them were recruited from the Atlantic ports, so they were never truly content to be in the Mediterranean, far from home, long before the matters came to a head here. Now our admirals are trying to decide what to do with them. We cannot just kick them out. 5,000 strong, they would only swell the ranks of the besieging force. Nor can we keep them here, either locked up or on parole, since they would then present an internal danger.
The people of Toulon? The French captain shook his head.
Not every Toulonnais citizen is in agreement with our rapprochement with you. Combine them with those sailors, and they represent too much of a threat in a place so feverish with rumour and dissent.
I seem to recall there were officers, too.
I think, Pearce, Danvers said, smiling properly for the first time, what you actually recall is my saying to Lord Hood there were none, that the men were leaderless. You no doubt saw that as a necessary deceit. You are more understanding than your admiral, who mentions my dissimulation frequently and never without a black look to accompany his strictures.
From below came the sound of stamping marine boots, and Danvers began to move.
I must hurry, or my admiral will depart without me. So far have I fallen from grace.
Then I suspect, sir, said Pearce with real feeling, that the sight of you reminds him of his own failures of duty. Lieutenant Pearce! Lieutenant Pearce! The blue-coated youngster, a mere child in clothing too big for his slight frame, crying out his name, emerged from a companionway looking worried. The expression deepened considerably when the object of his search identified himself. "Sir, you were supposed to wait outside the Admiral's quarters on the main deck." HMS Victory was a ship at anchor, wallowing in some of its own filth, and with some 700 men aboard her crammed into her lower decks, it was not pleasant in terms of odours even on the main deck. But that was not the reason he was standing on the quarter-deck. Pearce would not say that the courtesy normally extended to a visiting officer aboard a flagship, that of the use of the wardroom and perhaps a glass of some refreshment, had not been offered, as it had when he had come aboard before. He was slightly upset that it should be so, but in no position to do anything about it, and damned sure he was not about to beg. "I like fresh air." "The Admiral's secretary is in a rare passion."
"Well," snapped Pearce, who had crossed swords with the supercilious sod before, "a bit of passion might do him good. It might warm his blood enough to ensure he is still living."
"You must hurry, sir," moaned the midshipman, "for my sake, if not your own." Much as he would have liked to dawdle, if for no other reason than to annoy, he had no choice but to follow at the boy's brisk pace. The crabbed look on the face of Hood's secretary was compensation. Normally a languid and superior sort, he looked quite put out as he followed Pearce into the great cabin, where sat Hood and the slightly more corpulent figure of Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, who held the position of captain of the fleet.
"Pass your dispatches and logs to my secretary, Mr. Pearce," said Hood. This he did, and the secretary departed with them as the Admiral added, "I will have a verbal report on what was plainly a piece of downright and calculated insubordination."
Pearce explained about the situation of the Mariette, and the apparently defenceless position in which they had found her. "Captain Benton saw it as too good an opportunity to pass up, sir." In the face of a sceptical superior, Pearce went on to describe the action, praising, as he had in his dispatch, the actions of the crew of HMS Weasel, and in particular the bravery of young Midshipman Harbin, as well as the tactical appreciation of the master, Mr. Neame. He made no mention of his own wound. By now he was hardly conscious of it himself, and it was gratifying to observe, as he spoke, the look of outright hostility fade in Hood's craggy countenance, to the point where he looked quite satisfied. "And, sir, might I point out that before deciding to act, Captain Benton asked me what he thought you, faced with a similar problem, would have done."
"And what did you tell him, Pearce?" demanded Hyde Parker. "If I may say, sir, that I have never been comfortable with flattery, I feel I will have provided an answer."
"Well," said a clearly mollified Hood, "what is done, and I am told she is a fine vessel."
"She is totally deficient in powder and shot, sir." Hood laughed, the first time Pearce had seen him do so with anything approaching real heartiness.
"Then we will fill her up from the Toulon arsenal, Pearce, but not until my own master has had a look over her to assess her value."
"The crew will be anxious to know if you will buy her in, sir." The humour evaporated as quickly as it had surfaced.
"I dare say, Pearce, just as I dare say that in their addled brains they've already spent the money she will fetch. But I must tread with care. I cannot say anything until Admiral Trogoff agrees that she is a prize and not part of the fleet which he commands."
"On the other matter, the one we discussed when I first came aboard."
"Remind me,"
Hood replied, but he had a look that told Pearce he knew very well the subject mentioned. "Captain Barclay's illegal impressments in London, sir. I was a victim, and so were several men now serving against their will aboard HMS Leander. Barclay has broken every rule in creation, and I demand that he faces punishment for it." Hood's face was suddenly suffused with angry blood.
"Demand, sir? You will not demand in my cabin."
Hyde Parker interjected, speaking in a more measured tone. "What Lord Hood is saying, Lieutenant Pearce, is that the matter is under consideration." "Which it was before I went aboard HMS Weasel 2 weeks past." Hood barked again.
"Damn you, sir, do not interrupt your superior."
"If I feel the laws of England are being ignored, then I have a duty to—" Hood's voice this time, as he cut across that of John Pearce, was loud enough to be heard through 3 feet of planking.
"Don't you dare prate unto me about the laws of England, sir, not with your parentage. I was a member of the government that proscribed your father for his blatant sedition. Do not forget that he, and no doubt you, had so little regard for the laws of England that you were obliged to flee to France to avoid them."
Said like that, there was not much Pearce could put forward in defence. His father, after the fall of the Bastille, had gone from being a peripatetic radical speaker who could be safely ignored to a much sought-after orator and pamphleteer in a country where many a subject of King George saw the events across the Channel as a bright new dawn. Known as the Edinburgh Ranter, Adam Pearce was perceived as a man of much sense and wisdom by those people who sought some of the same change in Britain. His attacks on the monarchy and the ministers who served the king had relied on logic and irony to show the absurdity of both. His message, one that sought universal suffrage for both sexes, an end to the great landed fortunes, a fairer distribution of the wealth of the nation, and the termination of royal dominion. He was not alone in this. There were others preaching the same message, one which alarmed those in power. Excess in France, or the constant application of it, had moved opinion away from support for the revolutionaries. Edmund Burke had fulminated in speech and print against the mayhem and disorder of Paris, and every event seemed to make nervous a population that saw Britannia as a more stable country than France. When opinion had shifted enough, the government decided it could move against the likes of Adam Pearce, one of his more fulminating pamphlets providing the excuse to imprison both him and his son. On release, made through the intercession of like-minded but respected members of various corresponding societies, old Adam had not diluted his message. He had, in a written pamphlet, demanded the removal of King George and his heirs. Those were the words that forced him to flee to Paris, to be originally hailed as a friend. That had not been sustained. People in power in Paris had no more time for a man who questioned their right to rule than Hanoverian kings. Refusing to be browbeaten, Pearce replied, I think, sir, if you examine the laws of England, you will find that it was you and your colleagues who ignored them, not I or my father.
Parker, Hood spat, am I to be obliged to dispute in my own cabin with a mere lieutenant?
I agree, sir, it is hardly fitting.
My case, Pearce demanded.
Will be dealt with, sir. Now, please oblige us and leave.
Am I to go back to my ship?
Damn you, sir, she is not your ship. Shift your dunnage out of HMS Weasel this instant, so that I can find someone fit to command her.
Report ashore to Captain Elphinstone, said Parker, who is overseeing the defence of the port. I'm sure he can find a use for you.
Is there anything I can tell the crew of HMS Weasel?
No, Lieutenant Pearce, there is not.
The temptation to stay and continue the dispute was strong, but Pearce knew if he did so he would not aid his own argument, just as he knew that in baiting Hood about legality he had not done his case any favours. Outside he walked towards the entry port, cursing himself, only to be intercepted by the flagship's premier, Mr. Ingleby.
"Lieutenant Pearce, I have come to apologize to you."
"Sir?"
"I was ashore, as was every other lieutenant, on an inspection of the French capital ships. That the officer of the watch, nor the master or the surgeon, for that matter, failed to offer you the use of the wardroom is a disgrace, and you with a fine capture under your belt. I ask that you join me now."
Still angry with himself, and not wishing to have to recount the recent action in the taking of the Mariette, which he would surely be obliged to do, Pearce declined. "I have much to see to, Mr. Ingleby, and I am ordered ashore in any case, so I must shift my possessions. But should my duty permit, I would happily accept an invitation for some future date."
"The Wardroom of Victory will have you as a guest to dinner, sir. You have my word on it. There is nothing like a table and a circulating decanter to add spice to the story of an action."
"That young firebrand," said Lord Hood, in a tone of regret rather than continued anger, "will get himself shot on the quarterdeck one day."
"I must say he has a genius for trouble," Parker replied. "Yet we must admit he also has a claim."
"I can send him home, can I not?"
"You can send him to India, if you so desire. But I have a feeling that that will not rid you of him. He has a family history of tenacity. We must hope Captain Elphinstone will keep him occupied."
"Maybe one of Carto's cannonballs will take off his crown."
Hood shook his own head.
"I don't mean that, Parker. You know I don't. If anything, apart from his damned attitude, I quite admire the fellow."
The old Admiral's voice became somewhat wistful.
"And, you know, he has seen nothing but action since he was received aboard Brilliant. I know of officers in this very fleet who have served for decades and not so much as seen a shot fired in anger. Yet that young pest, wherever he goes, seems to get into a fight."
"Captain Barclay?" asked Parker.
Hood drummed his fingers on the highly polished table he used as a desk. Only he was privy to all the facts that laid constraints upon that which he could do. Pearce had brought from England a personal letter from the First Lord of the Treasury and the King's First Minister, William Pitt, which laid upon Hood certain limitations. He had no time for William Hotham as a second-in-command or as a person, and they were on either side of the political divide at home. But with a war to fight, Pitt was looking for allies in some of his erstwhile political opponents. Hotham was close to the Duke of Portland, who might lead a breakaway Whig faction and give valuable support to the government. He had had, from Pitt, strict instructions not to upset the sod, which would have mattered little in this particular case if Hotham had not taken it upon himself to become Barclay's sponsor. Give Pearce his court-martial for Barclay's illegal impressments, and he did not doubt the man had a case to answer, and that would alienate Hotham.
We allowed Hotspur to send Pearce away on his cruise, did we not, Parker?"
A stickler for the correct form of words, Parker replied,
"We allowed him to dispatch Benton, who was his protégé, on what was seen as an essential mission. It was he who sent Pearce along as his premier, an elevation that makes no sense, unless you count the notion that Hotham is determined to protect Berkeley." "Can you see the way my mind is working, Parker?"
That was part of Parker's job as captain of the fleet, to be an experienced and trusted sounding board for his commanding admiral. The other part was to oversee the fleet at sea, to keep the vessels on station, and to receive and act upon the daily reports sent in by each ship's captain regarding the state of their ships and stores. Known as a man of sound and patient judgment, he was not fool enough to reply. He had a shrewd idea what Hood was about to propose, and he wanted no part of the responsibility for an act which might well rebound badly and harm his own career. It was all right for Hood. At 70 years of age, after a lifetime of service as well as participation in several successful battles during the American Revolutionary War, he was reasonably impervious to censure, and this was probably his swan-song command. Parker had prospects ahead of him, of command to come and perhaps battles and glory to win, and he was not about to jeopardize them.
"You don't reply," said Hood, seeking to hide his amusement. He knew very well what Parker was about. "You do not see that the problem really resides with my second-in-command. Berkeley is attached to his flag, not mine, and I would not have the swine if he applied, so let Hotham deal with it. If he saves Berkeley's hide, then he can preen himself. If he does not, then I cannot be blamed. Damn me, Parker! I'm beginning to wonder if I've spent too much of my recent time in the company of politicians."
"I think, sir," Parker replied smoothly, and well aware that in the area of politics Hood was capable of looking after himself, "in regard to Admiral Hotham, that is a proposition which could only come from you." Chapter 3. Being rowed ashore, Pearce could still feel the lump in his throat, a sensation which had come with the farewells attendant on leaving HMS Weasel. Mr. Neame and Ottershaw had been loud in their regrets that he was departing, but that might be because the quality of the wine would diminish. The crew muted, through either indifference or the notion that to show any sort of feeling would cause embarrassment. He left the likes of the gunner without regret. He was a man who saw his cannon as pets rather than instruments of war, and hated to see them or his precious store of powder in use. Freckle-faced Harbin had proved the hardest when it came to a parting. A youth with an abundance of enthusiasm and courage, he was also prey to a like amount of sentiment, and his tears at the news had nearly done for Pearce. But in reality, what saddened him most was the loss of independence. It might have come about by accident, but he had been in command of a ship for several days, and he had thoroughly enjoyed the experience, even in recollection the storm through which they had sailed. How different was the King's Navy when you had freedom from oversight and the privacy of a captain's cabin. He would have liked to go aboard HMS Leander and seek out his friends, to assure them that he was still hot on the task of getting them freed. But that bastard Tabley had made it plain he would bar him from setting foot on his deck, so he decided instead to visit the hospital on the Saint-Mandrier Peninsula, where he had no doubt HMS Brilliant's surgeon, Heinrich Lutyens, would still be plying his trade. Captain Elphinstone, whoever he was, could wait a while. He was thinking on that when he heard the coxswain order the oarsmen to ship their sticks, and looking for the reason, he saw a senior officer's barge racing across the bow, with the stoic and rigid figure of Admiral Hood in the thwarts. William Hotham did not enjoy many conferences with his commanding officer, and certainly Hood had never visited him aboard HMS Britannia. He was, on the rare occasions he was consulted, more likely to be summoned. So when he was informed of the approach of Hood's barge, all his hackles rose in suspicion, a feeling not diminished by the greeting the older man gave him, as, in his best bib and tucker, with much piping and a solid stamp from the few marines left on the ship, he welcomed his superior aboard at the entry port.
"By damn, sir, you have a fine-looking vessel here. Always liked her trim. Not been aboard her since I was commissioner at Portsmouth. Rodney had his flag on her then, of course."
"Quite," Hotham replied, wondering at the mention of that admiral. It was no secret that Hood and the late Admiral Sir George Bridges Rodney had disliked each other intensely, and disputed the proper way of thinking and fighting so furiously that it was not a name to bring forth in his presence.
"Thought it about time I paid you a visit, sir. Can't have you forever getting yourself soaked to come aboard Victory. Too much of that, and you'll be as much of a martyr to the ague as I."
Having referred to that illness, Hood strode briskly down the short line of the remaining marines, nodded his approval, offered his greetings to the other ship's officers, then made his way aft. Hotham was a man known to like his belly, so it was no surprise to find a fine spread of sweetmeats and fruit in his cabin, plus a very passable decanter of claret hastily poured by his steward. Insincere courtesies exchanged and hunger assuaged, Hood came to the first of his points, the problem of the 5,000 French Republican sailors and what needed to be done with them.
"We must get them out of the place. I take it you agree?"
The nod was slow to come, but come it did.
"I have had words with Trogoff, and proposed that we strip out a quartet of seaworthy 74s, all the cannon barring a couple of 8-pounders for signalling, fill them full of those damned seamen and get them out of here."
"To where?"
"Well, it'll have to be the Atlantic ports. Can't land them anywhere in the Med, or they'll cease to be sailors and become soldiers. Lambert tells me they wouldn't even think of Genoa, and I doubt the locals there would take kindly to having that number dumped on them. They were conscripted from Lorient, Rochefort, and Brest, anyway. He also says they were a damn nuisance long before we arrived, much tainted by being overindulged with the disease of rebellion. There will only be a brace of officers per ship, but they have warrants as well, so sailing them should be simple."
Hotham fiddled with a walnut and the instrument with which he would crack it. "You would be handing the French Navy a set of capital ships. All they have to do is refit them with cannon, powder, and shot, and from the Bay of Biscay they can go anywhere, even come back here."
"Parker and I have discussed this at length, and it is a damn nuisance, but I can see no other way. But it must be done with the active participation of each one of the fleet admirals. I need you to agree, and in writing."
"You do not see that as interfering with your prerogatives?"
"I do believe Byng had prerogatives, Admiral, and a lot of good it did him."
Hotham nodded slowly at the mention of that name. Admiral Byng had been shot on his own quarterdeck for what was seen as a dereliction of his duty in not supporting the besieged British outpost of Fort St. Philip on Minorca against the Spanish in the 7 Years' War, the result being the loss of both the fort and the island. Most of his fellow sailors had seen the execution for what it was, a political act by a vengeful government aided by spiteful inferior officers keen to exculpate themselves from what was seen as a naval disgrace. It had, however, a huge impact. Even the sage Voltaire had commented on it from Switzerland, terming it an action pour encourager les autres. He was right. The others were encouraged. Now no flag officer would lightly take a decision that might threaten the same fate. Hood's junior admiral never answered any inquiry quickly. He was known for it. And he did not do so now. He messily cracked a walnut and nibbled at a piece of it first, no doubt weighing up the consequences. If he was looking for alternatives, Hood knew there were none. The only other option was to keep them here.
"I am, of course, at your service." "Obliged, sir. I have one other vexing problem, Autumn, and I need your advice. 'Tis this Berkeley business."
Autumn raised his eyebrows as though offended, though Hood would have been at a loss to know if it was the subject that alarmed him or the abrupt way it had been introduced. Since he once more failed to respond, Hood continued,
"That, too, is a damned nuisance, and I am at a loss to know how to handle it. You are aware, I am sure, that this Pearce fellow has threatened to call Captain Berkeley out." "Has he, by damn? He will not call a man out in my command. Has he not been told it is strictly forbidden for naval officers to duel by royal statute?"
Another piece of walnut had to be nibbled before Hotham spoke again.
"He has, but I fear any strictures of yours might be ignored, sir. He is not much given to obeying orders, even royal ones. Hardly surprising, given that he is not truly an officer."
Hood had to bite his tongue then. Benton had been, like Berkeley, Hotham's protégé, and he had failed in the respect of strict obedience to orders. It would have been nice to put Hotham in his place, to force him to defend the late Benton. But that would not serve.
"I intend to be candid with you, sir."
The raised eyebrows in Hotham's smooth and well-fed face looked like disbelief.
"That is something I can only welcome, my lord. Ralph Berkeley is not a man for whom I have much in the way of affection."
"While I," Hotham replied with rare force, "find him an excellent officer."
"Oh, I don't doubt he is brave and runs a good tight ship. It is the personal line I speak of. You know, I saw him hours before this wretched business is supposed to have taken place." "Indeed I do, sir." "So you know I warned him about taking any actions which would be detrimental to the good of the service. It was a quite specific caution to be careful where he pressed, if he intended to do so." "I seem to recall being present when the matter was first broached in your cabin." "And I," Hood thought, "recall only too well how you stood up for the swine, on both the loss of his ship to the enemy and his impressment of the men Pearce wanted freed, making plain you would go to some lengths to protect him."
"Captain Berkeley was short on his compliment, was he not?" Hotham demanded.
"What captain sails to war with a full complement, Hotham, eh? 'Tis the fate of us all."
"Can I offer you a walnut, sir?" said Hotham, proffering the nut bowl. As Hood declined, Hotham was thinking about what had just been said. Berkeley had indeed sought men to man his frigate, short-handed to the tune of a quarter of her full crew, and when he had done so it was in the certain knowledge that Hood, at the time the senior sea officer at the Admiralty, had at his disposal several hundred proper sailors lodged at the Tower of London. But the man was angling for the Channel Fleet, which would allow him not only to hold that command but to keep his political office at the Admiralty. The King wanted the Channel for his favourite Admiral Black Dick Howe. Hood could have the Mediterranean. Determined not to give in to the monarch without a fight, Hood was damned if he was going to release any drafts of seamen until he knew which fleet he would get. Whichever, no vessel in his command would be short on his complement when they sailed.
"You know that Pearce wants a court-martial," said Hood.
"And do you intend to oblige him?"
"Admiral Hotham, I cannot see, if he continues to press the matter, how I can refuse."
Being slow of response did not mean that William Hotham was not a deep thinker. Indeed, it was that quality which defined him. He was wondering, having been through something very similar before, if Hood was looking for the same solution, namely to offload the problem onto him. He prided himself on his ability to extrapolate from a given set of circumstances and to see the possible lines of consequence. Also, he knew where he stood in the scheme of things at home. Hood did not want to distress him, quite unaware that by his attitude up till now he had more than done so, a fact which had gone home in every letter Hotham had written to people of his own political persuasion. But did he want what was being offered? And would Hood use it against him to show that he was prepared to protect someone like Ralph Berkeley, even if it was clear he was possibly in the wrong? What was vexing was the fact that he needed to protect him. All of those captains who looked to him for advancement knew he had taken Berkeley under his wing. They had dined at the Hotham table and seen for themselves the connection, no doubt more interested in the way it reflected on their own standing than on the mere fact of it being so. If he let Berkeley down, he would be diminished in their eyes, and that was an unwelcome thought. For a quick-witted and decisive creature like Samuel Hood, watching Hotham's dawdling mental process was torture. He knew that silence was best, and it was as if his whole body was itching as impatience took over.
"I was wondering if you could see any way out of this dilemma."
"I think, Lord Hood, you wish for me to continue to handle this problem."
"I wish for your opinion, sir,"
Hood lied. 10 agonizing seconds elapsed before Hotham gave it.
"I will make no secret of my feelings, sir. That a poltroon like Pearce can traduce the reputation of a brave and competent officer fills me with rage. Yet he cannot, as you have admitted, be denied his court-martial. So let it be, and let us work as hard as we may to prove that the accusation against Captain Berkeley is false."
"Then," Hood said, trying to hide his relief,
"I leave the matter in your capable hands. You may set the date and choose the officers to sit in judgment on the case. When you have your verdict, I will, of course, confirm whatever the court decides."
John Pearce had not expected to run into Emily Berkeley at the hospital, and in doing so now there was that same frisson of awkwardness which had attended their last encounter, though he tried to cover that with a warm smile. She was dressed in a white pinafore, her hair pinned back under a mob cap, yet was still strikingly good-looking, the young face fresh, the unpowdered cheeks rosy, and her eyes alight with appeal. Pearce experienced the same feeling he had when he had first clapped eyes on her on the deck of HMS Brilliant, when coming aboard as a pressed man. Then his smile vanished as he recalled the blow from her husband such attention had earned him. "Mrs. Berkeley," he said with a slight bow that covered his frown. She gave a minimal curtsy, thinking that the presence of this man disturbed her, for it raised not only memories of a serious marital dispute, but thoughts regarding her husband that she had been able to bury these last few weeks, thoughts that her spouse was not as upright and honest as he should be. It was difficult to know what to say. "Lieutenant Pearce, would I be permitted to ask after your arm?" Lutyens had been seeing to that wound on the last occasion they met. It would be bravado to mention the other one. "Quite mended, madam, and entirely free from any putrescence. I take it by your attire you are assisting Mr. Lutyens." The slight laugh made Pearce's extremities tingle. On that cold, wet day off Sheerness, with the River Thames grey and miserable at his back, he had found it easy to imagine paying court to such a pretty creature, and it was just as effortless to rekindle that here and now. "I fear I may often be more of a hindrance to our good surgeon than a help."
"Nonsense!"
That sharp rebuke came not from John Pearce, but from Heinrich Lutyens, standing in the doorway, his eyebrows well aloft, his long nose also raised in his fish-like face. "You raise the spirits of the men, Mrs. Berkeley, and that does more for their condition than any ministrations of mine. Do not think I do not see their faces cloud as I approach." Both John Pearce and Emily Berkeley had an awkward moment then. Every patient treated by Lutyens had a similar experience, generally a painful one. He was not cack-handed exactly, just distracted and indifferent, having often stated that the physical aspects of medicine held little of interest to him. His patients could not agree, and he always gave them cause to feel their opinion.
"John Pearce, you are returned."
And in one piece. Lutyens indicated the sea outside the windows, now bright blue and less disturbed.
"One of my patients, an ambulant fellow, pointed out the approach of your ship. I am given to understand that, according to your flags, you have suffered both a tragic loss and victory over our enemies."
"The first ill fortune, the second the opposite, of which I am the beneficiary."
"We will take coffee together, and you may tell me all. Mrs. Barclay, will you join us?"
She blushed bright red, nailing her reply as an excuse. "I fear I cannot. I am expected. Indeed, I would be surprised if the boat my husband sends for me is not waiting at this very moment." As if to emphasize that, she began to untie the knot at the rear of her pinafore. Lutyens, with a look of passive acceptance for an obvious untruth, just nodded. Being the surgeon of her husband's frigate, a man who had witnessed the confrontation of John Pearce and Ralph Barclay, and who had also heard of the words exchanged at their last meeting, he knew only too well why she had declined. Both sets of male eyes followed her as she scurried out of the room, and had they been honest with each other, they might have admitted to similar thoughts. "Poor creature," Lutyens said softly.
"Why so?"
asked Pearce. The surgeon half smiled. "That is for me to know, and you to ponder."
"Now let us have that pot of coffee and your tale.
"A battle did you have?" Pearce nodded.
"Then I am particularly interested in your impression of the behavior of the crew. I wish to compare it with my own recent experiences."
John Pearce decided to keep quiet about the ball that had grazed his arm to Lutyens as well. Given his method of treatment, it was less painful that way. It was an hour before the boat arrived to take Emily Barclay back to HMS Brilliant, an hour in which she had fretted that she might again meet with John Pearce, an hour in which she knew it was an encounter she would have to keep secret from her husband. It was therefore truly unfortunate that one of the two people rowing her boat was a fresh-faced youth with a half-broken voice called Martin Dent, doubly so that Pearce came into sight, walking the shore with Lutyens in deep conversation as the boat made its landfall. The cry of the name filled the air, and spotting not only Martin but several other familiar faces, Pearce walked down to the small jetty to which the boat had been tied up. "Well, Martin, you are still whole."
"But too stupid to address you proper,"
said the man next to him, a boatswain's mate called Costello.
"If a captain was here, he'd flay him."
"I heard you was wearing a blue coat these days," said Martin, "though the how is a mystery."
The sight of Emily Barclay had done it, and Martin Dent had the same effect. It took him back to what had happened at the beginning of the year. Here, greeting him like a long-lost brother, was a youngster who had at one time tried to kill him, and who, he had no doubt, had been the cause of the death of another. In the dress of a marine drummer, Martin had been one of the party who had taken up him and the others, men who became his friends of necessity, from that Thameside tavern, the Pelican. Even on a warm day, in bright sunlight, surrounded by blue sea and the smell of burnt earth and sweet flowers, he could imagine himself back in that smoke-filled tavern. The faces of those with whom he had sought to evade the press gang swam before his eyes, especially Abel Scrivens, Martin Dent's victim. Then there was Ben Walker, the sixth member of his original mess, who had been washed overboard from HMS Brilliant in an encounter with a Barbary pirate ship. He would be alive today without his being pressed. Yet Martin had changed, had seen the error of his ways, had even apologized, and that was the fellow he addressed now. "I fear, Martin, in public you will have to touch your forelock if you spy me. But do not ever do so when no other officer is present, or I will be the one to flay you." "Should you have a ship, Pearce, it would be good to serve under you."
"Do not, Martin, pin any hopes on that. And don't be so sure that service under me will be so pleasant."
"You won't use the cat, Pearce. You was one of us." "Excuse me, Lieutenant."
Pearce stood aside to let Emily pass, then proffered his hand to help her down into the boat, something she could hardly refuse. The tingle that ran up his arm was as strange as it was noticeable, and he wondered if, under a wide straw sun hat hiding her face, she had experienced the same. There was no way of knowing. She kept her face turned away, even when, in a moment of inspiration, he asked Costello if he could catch a lift across to the other side of the bay. The favour granted, and his sea chest aboard, the youngster, all bright eyes and excitability, managed to embarrass Pearce, intrigue Emily Barclay, and bore the already aching arses off his fellow sailors, who had heard the tale a dozen times before, as he recounted how he and his old mate had once taken a whole merchant ship from under the noses of John Crapo. "I think you are forgetting, Martin," Pearce said eventually, in an attempt to shut him up, "that there were others present." "They don't signify to my mind, especially that toad Burns." "My nephew?" said Emily, surprised. "Why do you call him a toad?" Martin Dent would have loved to have told her he was worse. He was a cowardly rat, and even then he didn't know the mention of the name to John Pearce was inclined to make his blood boil. Toby Burns was a deceitful little bastard who had abandoned him to a second impressment within sight of the south coast of England. Much as he would have liked to say so, he could no more condemn the little swine with his aunt in earshot than could Martin Dent, who was obliged to emit an unconvincing apology. "Slip of the tongue, ma'am. Term of affection, really." "Shall we drop you off at the end of the mole, Lieutenant?" asked Emily. The voice had a tremor which had Pearce wondering at the reason. While his mind alighted on the possibility of attraction, hers was centred on the truth. For whatever reason, if her husband saw this officer in his ship's boat, he would have a seizure. "Obliged," said Pearce as he scrambled ashore, taking a slippery green ladder up the wall of the mole, his dunnage following. "Perhaps we may meet again." For the first time he heard her being sharp. "I fear it is unlikely, Lieutenant Pearce." "Take care, Martin." "You too, Pearce." The frigate, fully repaired from the battle in which she had been forced to strike her colours, lay in the inner harbour, and her husband had moved them both back on board as soon as he could, happier, as he insisted, to pace his own planking than to stay on in the tower in which they had been incarcerated as prisoners. He saw the boat approach and hurried down the gangplank to the quayside so he could assist his wife in climbing the ladder from boat to shore. Even after nearly a year of marriage, each time he saw Emily he still felt the need to pinch himself at his good fortune, which was not a thing he had enjoyed much favour from in his life. Deep down he knew that for his wife, duty was part of their nuptials, and entailed property that would have seen her parents and the rest of her family displaced from if he had enforced his rights. But she was still a wonder to Ralph Barclay. Beautiful, mainly dutiful, barring the odd squabble, and a positive asset in his dealing with his fellow officers. Not greeted by the habitual warm smile, he was taken aback at the pursed lips and unfocused look on his wife's face as she steadied herself on the quay.
"My dear, you look peaked. I do hope Lutchins has not been working you too hard."
Emily was still thinking about the events of the morning, of the sudden appearance of John Pearce, and the unpleasant thoughts regarding her husband's honesty in the days immediately before Lord Hood took over the port. Then there was the tale told by Martin Dent in the rowboat of the taking of that merchant vessel from a Breton port,
which differed substantially from that which had been told to her right after the action by her nephew Toby Burns. And why had Martin Dent called him a toad?
"We shall have a capital dinner to cheer you up, Mrs. Barclay," her husband said in a hearty voice designed to lift her spirits. "And I have invited young Burns to join us. You two may talk family to your heart's content."
That the thought had the opposite effect to that intended was made obvious by the deep frown which swept across Emily Barclay's face. Chapter 4. Elphinstone's headquarters were at the Citadel, the main bastion inside the Vauban defences, the well-ordered and designed buildings around it standing in stark contrast to the confusion that reigned outside the walls. It seemed he was responsible for the defence of the eastern sector, and parties of marines and sailors lay about, each seeking shade from the sun, looking listless and disengaged, this while officers, both French and British, scuttled about seemingly to no purpose, if you discounted that each seemed to carry in their hands written orders of some kind. Once inside the citadel, Pearce was hard put to find anyone who could tell him why he was here, and what he was required to do, though he did find that the officers had set up a mess, and being provisioned by the French, it was well stocked with both food and wine. So, in the absence of orders, he made up for what he had missed by treating himself to a good dinner. It was when he came to bedding down, a need that took him right into the heart of the headquarters, that he ran into the first real problem.
"Go back to your ship, sir, like everyone else,"
said a weary-looking civilian clerk. "I do not have a ship." The clerk looked at him as if he had said he lacked a mother.
"If you have no ship, sir, I am at a loss to know how you got here."
"I was relieved of my duties aboard HMS Weasel this morning."
"HMS Weasel, sir? Did I hear you right when you said weasel?"
The voice was strong, definitely Scottish, if of the refined sort, and when he turned, Pearce knew just by the man's presence that he was important. The grey hair was curled and fine, the eyes were penetrating in a face that probably wore, most often, a disapproving scowl, though it was more a look of deep curiosity now. He also had on his blue coat the twin epaulettes of a post-captain of 3 years' seniority.
"I did, sir. I had the honour to command her in the recent action off Corsica after the unfortunate death—"
The interruption was sharp.
"Of that drunken oaf, Benton."
"He was brave as well, sir," Pearce snapped, "and it does not become any fellow officer of whatever rank to speak ill of him now he's been killed."
"You would not, you insolent pup, be trying to put me in my place."
The smile on the man's face was at odds with the words. He was clearly amused by the notion.
"You will be Adam Pearce's boy. Hood spoke of you."
"I am, sir, and proud of it."
"Aye, that's a sharp rejoinder, laddie. There's no need to be ashamed of your bloodline, even if the man named was a damned menace."
Seeing Pearce begin to well up in defence, the post-captain carried on quickly,
"But I'll no damn a fellow for his antecedents, man. If I did, an Elphinstone would have to stab half the population of Scotland on sight, since we have been at odds with every one of them at some time in the last few hundred years. So, boy, I will treat you as one of my ain, till you show me I'm amiss."
Not sure how to respond, Pearce said, "I was inquiring about a berth, being now without a ship."
"Oh, we'll soon sort that out, laddie, will we not, Myers?"
Elphinstone was looking past Pearce to the now flustered clerk, who stammered his reply. "Well, we can board him on a local family, sir, but not at such short notice without we cause upset."
"Then make sure it is a good one. Tonight, Pearce, you can rest your head here in the citadel. Happen tomorrow we'll find you something to do."
"Thank you, sir."
"Have you dined?"
"Yes, sir, and most handsomely."
"Then you can sit with me as I take my dinner, and tell me all about your wee skirmish."
It was only when they had moved from wine to brandy a very fine brew from the Armagnac region, that they left the subject of the navy, captains overindulging in drunken battles, to move on to the subject of Adam Pearce.
"I met him long before you were born, when he was young and I a stripling of a midshipman," said Elphinstone. "Edinburgh is a small place in the social sense, and he was a bright man making his way. I think it was Boswell who introduced us, but it could have been the father of Malthus, the dour fiscal philosopher who was visiting Scotland."
"And how, sir, did you find him?"
"I told you, laddie, a damned nuisance with his ravings, but an amusing one, much more so than those who still hankered after that popish fool of a Stuart."
Seeing Pearce raise an eyebrow, Elphinstone added,
"Don't imagine their dreams died in 45, laddie. They see their erstwhile king as a romantic hero, instead of what he really was, a wine-sodden fop with nothing in his gonads but water."
"At least I think my father would have agreed with you there."
"For the very reason that he hated monarchs, laddie, Stuart or any other, which borders on blasphemy. He was a contentious man when his humour failed, and I often wonder if it was just disputation or principle that was his abiding animation. Let me assure you, sir, that it was principle."
An aide entered and placed before Elphinstone a sheaf of reports which he began to read, leaving Pearce nursing his glass in silence. In a haze of slight inebriation brought on by wine and Armagnac, Pearce could recall his father in his prime, a fast-walking, busy man, not the broken invalid he had last set eyes on. The fire in the eyes, the passion in the voice as he harangued crowds all over the land, seeking to bring them to a realization of their plight as exploited labour. This took place while son John plied the crowd and tried to collect enough in his hat to pay for a decent night's lodging and a good dinner. Sometimes they got an invite to the nearest great house. Odd how they had often been on the receiving end of hospitality from the very people his father condemned, rich men on big estates, who seemed happy to have under their roof, and to dispute with, a radical orator who wanted to burn their mansions over their heads, as well as give their land to their tenants. At other times Adam and John Pearce had been obliged to sleep in the open, or, if it was too cold, in a barn or a byre. Yet it had been a happy time in the main, when, as a boy should, he believed what his father advocated, and trusted whatever he said had to be true. Occasionally they settled for a short period, and he was forced to attend school, there to defend those parental ideas with fist and feet, teeth and elbow, this taking place out of sight of masters who, when they were sober enough to wield the birch, saw that as the way to drum knowledge into young heads.
"Army of Italy!"
barked Elphinstone. That dragged Pearce out of a reverie in which the many hardships he had suffered, the Fleet prison included, seemed to be overborne by the good times, sunlit days, fishing or tickling trout in sparkling streams, abundant apples on trees, with one eye out for a bailiff, eating heartily in post-house inns amongst folk travelling from one place to another, all with a tale to tell to an eager young ear. At other times, striding out along country roads to shouted greetings from those toiling to get in the harvest, occasionally sharing a pail of beer, and a memory of a parent who cared mightily to make sure his son was educated by patient instruction, giving him a smattering of Greek, Latin, of counting and grammar, plus his own interpretation of history.
"Damn fool name for a rabble."
"Sir?"
"That mob of bare-assed villains who hold us in from the east, who favour themselves with this grandiloquent sobriquet. The army of Italy be damned. And if the man commanding them is a general, I am a regimental goat. If they have 10 pairs of boots between them, I'd be amazed. But it seems they are stirring, laddie, which is not good news."
Captain Elphinstone dropped his voice, not to a whisper exactly, but low enough to avoid being overheard, as though the French were listening in the walls.
"We wanted them supine, which they have been, thank God, since they hauled their bare feet from the Po Valley. Containing Carto to the west is task enough with what we have. If La Poip—"
Seeing John Pearce's confusion, he quietly enlightened him.
Their general, most likely a sergeant before the upheavals, and a timid scunner at that. He has sat on his arse doing nothing, which suited us just fine."
He picked up one of the reports.
"But this tells me he is stirring to make an assault on the Lartigue and Fort Faron."
"Will he succeed?"
"Never, laddie. But any assault draws troops from the west for the defence, and no doubt we will lose men we can ill afford to drive him back."
Elphinstone looked at the report in his hand again, and when he had reread it he waved it at Pearce.
"This does not tell me near enough. I need a man to go to Fort Faron and give me a clear picture, and, if necessary, take some action to contain him. That you will do in the morning. I will have you roused out an hour before dawn."
Suddenly Pearce was a little more sober. "With respect, sir, I do not feel qualified to give you what you need. I have no knowledge of military tactics."
"Laddie," Elphinstone said emphatically, "you are a Scot and a proven fighter, as well as the holder of a king's commission, and the son of a born troublemaker. That, sir, will do me."
Neither the taste in Pearce's mouth nor the fur on his tongue was in any way eliminated by the hurried breakfast of bread, a fruit compote and coffee, consumed long before first light. Taking from his kit all that he would need, he found Elphinstone's clerk had written orders for him, which meant that his master had stayed up long after Pearce had staggered off to bed. Outside the citadel stood a file of soldiers from the 11th Regiment of Foot and a group of sailors he was to take up to the position. The soldiers were under the command of a weary-looking lieutenant called Dilnot, to whom he would have happily surrendered command, but a naval lieutenant outranked a red-coated one, and the fellow showed no sign of seeking to dispute his rights.
"Arsenal first," said Pearce, having read his orders. "We're to haul some cannon up those hills."
The expression on the faces of the sailors was indicative enough of the undesirability of that task. Toulon sat in a bowl of mountainous terrain, and anything going out to the defences, barring the road to Marseille, meant going up a steep incline. Oxen, he was quietly informed by Robert Shaw, the coxswain in charge of the sailors, could only do so much. Manpower had to be employed, and he managed to make it plain that his tars would not take it kindly if the bullocks, soldiers drafted to serve in a marine capacity by the exigencies of war, thought they could just march alongside toiling seamen. At the arsenal, by the French fleet's gun wharf, the dockyard mateys, none of whom spoke a word of English, aided by his party, loaded 9-pounder cannon weighing near 2 tons and their separate trunnions onto heavy-duty ox-drawn wagons, as well as the shot and powder that would serve them. 2 cable-length pieces of rope were added as well, along with some lighter hemp, a couple of double blocks, and some chain. "Lieutenant, I wish your men to divest themselves of their weapons, equipment, and red coats." Dilnot looked at him with raised eyebrows, forcing him to continue. "It will be quicker for us if we all work to get the guns into position. I have no desire to be on the roadway in too much of the midday sun." "Water," said Dilnot. "What?" "The town is well supplied with clean drinking water. Might I suggest, sir, that the provision of that will make matters easier, especially when the sun is at full strength. That and some biscuit. As for midday, I doubt we will reach our destination before it is the naval time for dinner." "Make it so, Mr. Dilnot," Pearce replied, adding, as the redcoat turned to issue orders, "and thank you for bringing to my attention something I should have thought of myself. Sir, would it be possible to dispense with that too, Mr. Dilnot? It is a courtesy only." That brought forth a smile. "Happily, Mr. Pearce. Should you perceive any other errors of mine, please feel free to point them out. A naval officer ashore cannot surely be as knowledgeable as a soldier." Pearce then indicated 2 of the largest and most muscular soldiers. "We want 2 levers in their hands, long ones, to use as rear brakes. I fear the oxen will need regular rest, too. And the men, Mr. Pearce. Let us not forget the men." It was a bedraggled bunch that finally made it to the redoubt facing the so-called Army of Italy. The oxen had found the pavé streets of Toulon hard enough, but they soon ran out, and it became a struggle on rutted tracks that had dried hard throughout the summer months, tracks that would become quagmires at the first serious downpour. Pearce had occasion to be thankful for both Dilnot, who marshalled his men well, and the coxswain from HMS Swiftsure. Robert Shaw knew what to do without detailed instructions, and frequent halts were required so that the sailors could rig lines with the starter cable that helped the oxen on the steeper parts of the ascent, the two men at the rear also aiding that when they halted by anchoring the wheels. By the time they were halfway to the top, Pearce had removed his heavy blue coat, and asked Dilnot if he wished to do the same with his red one, so that they became, even if their shirts were linen rather than flannel, indistinguishable from their men. And taking Dilnot's point, Pearce made sure that everyone drank copiously, though the sailors were very vocal regarding the lack of the small beer to which they were accustomed, and adamant that it should have been replaced by wine. Pearce, nursing the dull ache of a hangover, was quite brusque. "I will tell you, and I have walked further, and in hotter weather than this, that fresh water is best. Now belay your moaning and rig the lines for the next section of track." Finally they crested the rise and got on to flattish ground, their speed much more satisfying as they approached the rear entry port to the redoubt. The fellow who greeted them, another naval lieutenant, had no idea, with their coats off, that he was addressing officers of any service. He began to berate the entire party for what he saw as their slow pace and general appearance. Pearce, that dull ache of a hangover adding to his irritation, positively yelled at him, demanding the date of his commission, which was considerably longer than his own. So he lied, added 4 years to the date of his elevation, declined to give his name, and left the poor fellow mumbling apologies for his presumption. While the ox wagons were lagered, Pearce and Dilnot, now properly dressed, had both produced telescopes to run their eyes over the French positions. Even Pearce could tell they, somewhat higher than their redoubt and over a mile away, were out of effective range of the cannon they had brought up, as well as the ordnance already in place, but he could not tell much more, except there was a mass of activity. "They are making fascines," Dilnot said, "and ladders." "Indeed," Pearce replied, wondering how he could see in a mass of moving bodies what they were up to. "So they are definitely preparing an assault. It'll be bloody, and I doubt, if this position is properly manned, they will succeed." "How long have you been a soldier, Mr. Dilnot?" "I'm a forced marine now, Mr. Pearce. I've been a soldier most of my life, and I would dearly like to return to that occupation." Pearce did not want to get into a dispute about the status of army men obliged to switch their service. He had other concerns. "Captain Elphinstone has asked me to make an appreciation of the situation, and I candidly admit to being at a loss to know what to tell him." The glass stayed at Dilnot's eye, but the response was good-humoured. "Then, sir, you are the only officer I have ever met of any service who admits to ignorance." "What do you observe?" Dilnot did not answer for a full minute, simply sweeping his telescope slowly back and forth. But Pearce knew he was thinking, and he appreciated the care the man was taking before replying. "Left to make their preparations, the French will attack at a time of their own choosing. Bad weather is not unknown in these parts, and we're slipping towards October. If they carry out their assault on a wet and windy night, the rain will make the cannon difficult to load and fire, while the wind will go a great way to covering the sound of their approach. So it will require a substantial body of men to be placed here to be sure of holding them." "Without knowing for how long?" asked Pearce. "If you are a self-confessed novice, sir, you have at least seen what they are about. The only men that can hold this position will have to be drawn off from those facing General Cato. Their absence presents him with an opportunity to push forward his own positions, to increase the threat to the anchorage." "Is there an alternative?" "Oh, Mr. Pearce, in war there is always an alternative." Dilnot was sweeping his small telescope around the surrounding landscape again.
Might I borrow your naval glass, Mr. Pearce? It is more powerful than mine."
That to his eye, Dilnot kept talking.
"The best way to avoid having to move troops to here is to disrupt whatever preparations they are making over yonder."
"How?"
"Cause casualties, break up their piles of ladders, set fire to their fascines, which will be tinder dry. Perhaps even blow to hell their general's tent."
"Cannon fire?" When Dilnot nodded, Pearce added, "At this range?"
"What if we could get closer?"
"Can we?" Dilnot pointed to a rocky outcrop halfway to the French position, slightly below the level of the enemy encampment.
"If we could get a pair of these 9-pounders out there, then we could give them a warm time."
Pearce was looking at the terrain in between, boulder-strewn scrub with the odd stunted tree bent over by the wind.
"Judging by the job we had getting the guns up here, I cannot see that would be easy."
"Easy, no, Mr. Pearce," the redcoat replied eagerly, "but possible. A bold stroke." The army man was excited, obvious even if he was trying to cover it up, which had Pearce wondering at his enthusiasm for his bold stroke. But he had to surmise there was a chance of advancement in the military for something outstanding. Even if they did buy their commissions, a hike in rank could be achieved by success.
"I fear, Mr. Dilnot, that you must tell me, for I would not dare to give an opinion."
That came quickly.
"We would need 2 cannon on lighter carts, with trunnions, beams and pulleys to make a hoist, a path cleared just wide enough to make possible their passage, and teams of sailors to get them onto the carts and to pull them, once used, back into our lines. The trunnions we can leave."
"They will not sit still and let our cannon destroy their encampment."
"No.
I may have little military knowledge, but I do know, Mr. Dilnot, that losing guns is a cardinal sin. That is a transgression I have no notion to commit, and whatever was achieved would surely be only temporary."
"I do believe, Mr. Pearce, Lord Hood anticipates that we will be reinforced."
"Indeed?" Dilnot was genuinely surprised at that display of ignorance.
"Have you not heard, sir? There are Austrian and Neapolitan troops on the way, and a request has been sent for the Gibraltar garrison, who are sitting idle when the Dons are our allies, and there may well be a draft from England. What we gain by delaying their assault could be immeasurable."
"Let me explain." "Please do so." Pearce had to return to the citadel to advise Captain Elphinstone, so he had Dilnot make plain his ideas, execute a drawing of the ground, write down the possible outcomes, and work out the times needed to execute his bold stroke, one he insisted was better than sitting waiting to be attacked. Back at the fort, Pearce was waiting as the post-captain rode up on a stout, short pony that had his legs near touching the ground.
"It might be inelegant, Pearce," he shouted, "but by God it's better than walking around the defences."
Elphinstone dismounted, rubbing his backside, which was clearly a source of pain and discomfort.
"So, what is the position as you see it at the Farren redoubt?"
"I consulted with an army officer, sir." Elphinstone nodded in approval. "And he has suggested the following course of action."
Pearce outlined what was really Dilnot's plan, but he not attending, it left him with no alternative to mention as often as possible that he had been in receipt of military advice.
"Yes, yes, laddie," Elphinstone barked when he said it for a 10th time. "Get to the point."
He did so, aware of and ashamed that it was beginning to sound as though he had formulated these ideas himself. "The first task, sir, is to go out after dark and clear a route. The primary part of the evacuation, getting the guns out over the defences, will not be a problem, but we will need a stout body of men on the last part to haul the guns back in. If we succeed, it will give the French pause and may even disrupt their plans to the point where they abandon any idea of an assault."
Elphinstone slapped him on the back.
"There, I knew you were a warrior, Pearce. Most Scots are. It's in the blood. And it's a damn good job we have stopped being so disputatious with each other."
"Do you know of a Lieutenant Dilnot, sir?" said Pearce, wishing to shift the praise. The response was surprising.
"That poltroon! Don't mention his name to me ever, Pearce. The man is a damned coward, proved in battle. He failed at Olliole, and got killed a good man called Douglas, a fellow Scot, as you will discern by the name. Should you come across him, do what any decent officer would do. Snub him."
Pearce was too dumbfounded to respond, as Elphinstone went back to his small pony and stiffly remounted.
"I need to go aboard Victory and report to Lord Hood. Give my clerk what you need in writing. I assume you will begin the clearing straight away, as we are without a moon."
"Of course, sir," said Pearce, who had only just realized that there would be, on this night, nothing more than a sliver of moon. Dilnot had, no doubt, calculated on that too. Chapter 5. Pearce went out with the marine party in a borrowed greatcoat, relying on starlight to see his way, which led to many a stumble and under-the-breath cursing. Dilnot had thrown out a screen of armed skirmishers well ahead, with orders not to fire their muskets unless absolutely necessary, to protect those clearing a path from being disturbed. At the same time, the party of sailors, under their competent coxswain, were laying out a pair of cables fetched from the arsenal, and rigging blocks to stakes that a unit of sappers had sunk into the ground behind the ramparts to the redoubt. Running the guns up the slope to that defence work, no doubt being pursued by the French, was not an option. The night was warm, with wind enough to rustle what foliage existed on such a barren landscape, with the odd clink of metal touching something solid, freezing everyone, in case it was the enemy patrolling prior to an attack, looking for a prisoner who could tell them the nature and numbers of the defence.
"Rossa,"
hissed Dilnot to his sergeant, a small Londoner.
"We want some brushwood cut to lay on the passage, otherwise the clearances we have made will look too obvious once the sun is up. And don't just roll any rocks and boulders to the side, move them a distance."
The sound of hacking seemed like the knell of doom, so loud was it, and that was when Dilnot's other ruse came into play. He carried a shaded lantern, and when he opened it to show a light to his rear, torches began to wave and move about, only enough to light the area right in front of the rampart, and loud shouting filled the air with the idea that if all French eyes were on the redoubt, they would not be simultaneously looking into the darkened hollow ground that lay between the positions. They worked their way forward to the base of the outcrop, and here the ground began to rise, not by much, but enough to imagine the task of hauling a cannon up there to be a telling one.
"It has to be human muscle, Mr. Pearce. We cannot risk an animal. But with good fortune we will have the whole night to accomplish it, and if we can get the cannon rigged on some reasonably level ground, I reckon we can make their encampment a place too warm for comfort."
The party worked on until Dilnot, carefully unshading to take a look at his fob watch, called a halt. Having done that, he went right to the edge of the small plateau on which he intended to sight the guns, and stared hard at the fires of the French encampment.
"You know, Mr. Pearce, it will be a fine thing to open up before they rally. Damn me, we could catch them in their smalls."
"If I am not mistaken, sir, it is time we retired."
"True. You go ahead while I call in my skirmishers."
They were all back behind the rampart walls as the sky turned grey, that soon followed by a red ball of sun rising behind the French camp, which led to an anxious period of waiting, till it rose enough to cease blinding those looking east, and showed that it would take a sharp eye to find the line of the track they had made during the night.
"Breakfast, I think, Mr. Pearce. Then I fancy that you, like me, will welcome some rest."
Dilnot stood his men down, and they immediately made up beds under the ox-wagons, shaded from the sunlight. Within minutes the first sound of snoring emerged, and that soon turned into a cacophony. Pearce, finishing a bowl of coffee, reckoned they had made a good night's work, and he had to admire the way Dilnot had handled things. Yet he was dying to ask what had caused Elphinstone's outburst, while knowing that was an impossibility.
"I am curious, sir, what tempted you to become a sailor?" Dilnot asked.
This had Pearce wondering if the man could read his mind, it being a perfect foil to deflect any questioning of him. To open up or dissemble? He decided on the latter. What Dilnot did not know would not hurt him, while finding he was in the presence of a military novice might affect his actions. "Shall I say, sir, that I had little choice?" "Choice," said Dilnot wistfully. "Few in this world have that." "You?" "My father was a soldier before me, Mr. Pearce, and reckoned the army the best career a man could aspire to, so I was chosen for the profession. He would turn in his grave to see me acting as a marine." "Is it so arduous a burden?" "Only at times." There was a strange glint in his eye as he added, "At others, like now, I would not wish to be elsewhere." "As you say, Mr. Dilnot, time to sleep, I think." "I must find a spot away from that racket my men are making." "Do you not have a billet in town?" "I do, and so do my men. But it seems bizarre to march all the way down to the old town, only to have to march all the way back up again tonight." "Our party of seamen will do it." "Your party of seamen are not carrying 60 pounds of kit, sir." A steady stream of supplies arrived as they slept. All the things Pearce, advised by Dilnot, had informed Elphinstone were necessary. A couple of light carts, a dozen balks of 12-foot timbers, some capstan bars, more blocks and pulleys, plus, as the sun dipped into the west, a strong party of tars who would be needed for what was hoped would be the final act. Dilnot had his men lined up and was, with his sergeant, checking their muskets, ensuring they had the requisite amount of powder and shot, and that their bayonets, which tended to get used for every job under the sun, had not been blunted. The sound of trudging boots had Pearce turn round to observe a dusty midshipman approaching, and seeing he'd been spotted, the lad grinned. "Mr. Pearce, sir, I have been sent to assist." "Mr. Harbin, I am glad to see you." "And I you, sir." "Mr. Dilnot, allow me to name Midshipman Harbin, who recently sailed with me. If he is to go out with us tonight, I beg you ensure you keep an eye on him. Otherwise he will be attacking the French command tent single-handed." Harbin blushed through 10,000 freckles as Dilnot greeted him. "Mr. Pearce, we need lifting frames erected, with pulleys to raise both the cannon and their trunnions onto the carts. Of necessity, they will have to be lifted over the rampart and their wheels replaced in open ground. It would be an asset if we could make that a single manoeuvre." When Pearce said he was glad to see Harbin, it was not just from affection. The boy was not only enthusiastic and brave, he was intelligent and knowledgeable in areas where his superior would struggle. Perfect for the task now in hand. Pearce listened carefully as Harbin outlined how he would carry out the manoeuvre, the right size of lifting frames, their location, a set of ropes and pulleys that would take the cannon over the rampart to a lower frame that would sit right on the level of the carts, once that had been established. "So you see, sir, it will slide very neatly onto a bed of straw." "Excellent, Mr. Harbin. I can leave you to get that rigged. The coxswain, Robert Shaw, and I will see to the carts." A set of fascines were placed upright outside the rampart to create a screen behind which, with torches, the men could work. Not perfect enough to entirely cut them off from view, but enough to cause confusion as to their purpose at a distance. The wheels of the smaller carts had been knocked off the axles, and as soon as the light faded, the body of each of the two were lifted over the rampart, the wheels put back in place once they were on the outside, and the necessary tools, powder, shot, and flintlocks, loaded on. Long, thick metal spikes, water for both men and materiel, levers to move the aim of the guns, spades to dig, and a tub of unlit slow match to ensure that if the flints malfunctioned, the cannon could still be fired. Harbin was as good as his word. If there was anything the Navy was good at, it was shifting 2-ton weights as though they were feathers. Using double blocks, the cannon were lifted clear of the ox wagons that had fetched them up the hill,
then slung onto a thick cable that sloped towards the cushioned bed of the carts. The trunnions followed quickly, and the gun crews who would fire these pieces took up the ropes with which they would haul. This as Dilnot sent his men out to form a defensive line in front of the party. "Mr. Harbin," called Pearce, seeing something that had been missed. "2 more cables to the rear of the carts. If we have to beat a hasty retreat, we will not have time to turn them round." "Our friends over yonder must wonder what we are about," said Dilnot. "If they come out in numbers to find out, we'll be in trouble." "Worth the risk, Mr. Dilnot?" "No doubt about it, Mr. Pearce." "Right. You behind the parapet, take the strain. Quench the torches and drop those fascines." The creak of the wheels, which had been greased, still sounded too loud for comfort as the carts were eased down the slope into the hollow ground. Once there, those cables were detached and left for later, as the seamen took up the strain on the front, leaning on capstan bars that had been lashed to the steering frame that controlled the front axle, a better method of forward movement over uneven ground than pulling. Dilnot's bullocks walked 50 paces ahead, bayonets fixed, 10 feet apart, the officer and his sergeant behind them to keep them dressed in the right line. Several times a wheel dropped into a depression. These were impossible to see in the low light of the stars, plus a sliver of new moon, and the carts needed to be levered out, in one case hauled backwards and manoeuvred round the obstacle. It took 3 hours to get to the foot of the incline leading to the proposed position, and at that point Pearce called to Dilnot to say every hand, his skirmishers included, would be needed to get up the slope, which was accomplished by a heave, moving it forward a few inches, with men again placed behind the rear wheels to jam in levers that would prevent the carts slipping backwards. Now a couple of inches would have seemed like a mile as the gun transports, in all weighing nearly 3 tons each, were eased up and up, until finally the front wheels crested the plateau and pushing became easier. There was not a man, officer, seaman or marine, who was not sweating buckets at the exertions. But there was no time to rest. Harbin had a frame and pulleys to rig, the trunnions coming off first, they being wheeled because they could be moved on their own, if not with ease, at least with effort. They were rolled into shallow forward-facing pits freshly dug, designed to absorb some of the recoil, and each cart was rolled over the top, so that the cannon could be lifted straight in the air. The cart was then removed and the weapon lowered into position. Having twice carried out that manoeuvre, the next task was to rig the lines that would also act to control the recoil, though the stakes that would be needed to hold them would have to wait till near dawn. That was the last task to be carried out. Powder and shot were unloaded and set in place, the cannon tompions removed, and the barrels swabbed before loading. Flints had been fitted, and the slow match lit out of sight to fizzle in the dark, bringing with it the smell of burning saltpetre. And ahead of them, still flickering in the dark, were the dying campfires of their enemy. "A grey goose at a quarter-mile, Mr. Dilnot." There was just enough light to see his quizzical expression as Pearce added, "'Tis a naval term, sir." "I only ask, are we wholly ready?" "We are, barring the stakes. Mr. Harbin." The midshipman stepped forward to kneel down, a long metal spike in his hand, this copied by 4 other tars. Above them stood the strongest of the seaman's party, each having in his hands a sledgehammer of formidable weight. There was no way to do this quietly, so on the command those hammers swung, and the clang as they hit the head of the spike reverberated around the hillsides, each blow so close it was impossible to tell what was real and what was echo. The looped restraints had been prepared in advance, and as each spike was sunk to as much depth as was required, those lines were attached and tightened. "All done, sir," said Harbin. "Then, young sir, I would suggest it is time to let our friends yonder know we are here." "Gun captains!" Harbin called. Both men nodded at Harbin's order, then admonished everyone to stand clear. This was no shipboard firing with trunnions rigged to be brought up short on thick cable restraints, or a well-fashioned redoubt with properly sighted artillery. No one had any idea what the cannon would do once fired. The gun captains themselves stood several yards back, holding the long lines that went to the flintlocks. Dilnot stood with his small telescope, Pearce with his larger instrument, their eyes fixed to observe the fall of shot, as both gun captains hauled hard. The flints fired the powder in the touch-hole, which set off the charge in the barrel, and a long orange tongue of flame shot from the muzzle as a 9-pounder cannonball was sent flying towards the French camp. The cannon shot backwards, the wheels in soft ground, the rear of the trunnions running onto hard-packed earth, the barrels threatening to rise enough to tip backwards until they were brought to a halt by the ropes. But it was obvious, as each whole ensemble dropped back to the ground, it was not exactly in the same place from which it had been fired. "We shall have to aim every time, lads," shouted Pearce, trying and failing to see where the balls had landed. What he did see was the utter confusion of an encampment rudely awakened. They had pickets out to ensure they did not fall to a sudden ground assault, but clearly they had not anticipated this. "I would say, Mr. Pearce," shouted Dilnot, "that rate of fire will count for more than accuracy." Pearce wasn't listening. He was watching the French gunners, shirts flapping in the breeze, rush to their own cannon, and he was aware that this was something he had not thought of. Perhaps forgivable, given his lack of knowledge. What was surprising was that Dilnot had failed to foresee it either. "You will also see, Mr. Dilnot, if you look left, that we are about to be in receipt of return fire." "Then it will be warm, sir," Dilnot replied in what sounded like a happy tone. "Very warm." Pearce was content to let the gun captains reset their cannon, but it was going to be a worryingly slow rate of fire, all the while thinking he could not agree with Dilnot. If their purpose here was to disrupt French preparations, then the cannon fire must be concentrated on achieving that. At least the sun had edged up behind a bank of cloud on the horizon, providing a clear sight of where the balls landed from their second salvo. They would not get off another without being paid back in kind. "Do we need to aim one cannon left?" Pearce asked, as the first of the defensive battery opened fire. It was obvious from fixed and prepared positions they would be able to lay down more accurate fire. Obvious that their outcrop, without the same kind of protective revetments as the French enjoyed, was dangerously exposed. "We have but a small window, Mr. Pearce. Let us concentrate on what we can achieve." Odd that Pearce felt more vulnerable on this plateau than he did on the deck of a ship, where at least there were bulwarks. More so as the first French ball ploughed into the face of the outcrop and sent up a huge plume of earth. It pleased him that his naval gun crews seemed impervious. They carried on as though no fire was coming their way, even when a ball hit the very edge and ballooned up to fly over their heads. Their salvo in reply sent 2 balls ploughing through the rows of tents in the centre of the encampment, causing mayhem as half-dressed men and officers ran in all directions. In truth, a mistake, since there was no telling which way the next cannonball would go. And now the counter-battery fire was steady. Yet if it was that, it was unlucky, for though much earth was moved, not one ball came close enough to their position to render it untenable. "Infantry forming up!" shouted Dilnot. Following his pointed finger, Pearce saw a mob of soldiers being hurried into formation, with swords flashing and waving, some, he suspected, being used on the confused men. Both gun captains tried to hit them before they had any kind of proper shape, and one ball, falling short, bounced off a protruding rocky outcrop to shoot on, sending dozens of bits of stone flying, to leave a clear line of bodies, some recumbent, others writhing, through the now disordered ranks, while what had been chipped off the rock took several men not yet in line. The next salvo achieved what they'd been trying to do since the outset. It hit the pile of scaling ladders that lay in the open, and reduced most of them to matchwood, sending splinters of the kind more common aboard ship to inflict gaping wounds on those who were close enough to suffer.
With several more balls erupting around their position, Pearce suspected that it was only a matter of time before luck shifted from them to the French gunners. Dilnot stood at the very edge of the plateau, seemingly impervious to the idea of death, his glass still trained on the enemy formation as they formed up in column before their own earthworks. Looking at the distance they would have to cover, and the distance back to their own redoubt, in daylight from the only place that a man could make a proper judgment, Pearce realized that what looked like a possibility from their own redoubt looked like madness from here. Getting these guns away was a nice idea, but probably an impossible one. There was reluctance to take charge. He knew little of warfare compared to Dilnot, but his gut feeling was such that he felt he had to. "Mr. Dilnot, I would suggest it is time to deploy your men away from the guns. They will be safer in a place to cover us and slow the enemy when we retire. I trust you will know what to do once you are in the hollow." Dilnot's voice had an agitated tone as he responded. "You intend to withdraw, Mr. Pearce?" "I do. We have done that for which we came, and to stay here is to invite annihilation. I fear I must make that an order." There was a pause, then Dilnot said, "My men can give you time, sir, with their muskets." There was something about Dilnot's expression, not disappointment, but a look in the eye that told Pearce he might welcome death, as long as it came with a dash of glory, and Elphinstone's words about the man being a damn proven coward came back to him. Was that what Dilnot was about? Trying to lay the ghost of a reputation and not really caring a damn whom he took with him in the process? "Please do as I ask, Mr. Dilnot, though I will in my report acknowledge your reluctance to accept such a command." That seemed to mollify the man, and he issued crisp orders to withdraw, following his men as they scurried down the slope in single file. The next order from Pearce was one he had to give, even if he did not want to. He could not risk the men he had led out here, any more than he could risk Dilnot's soldiers. The ball that went over his head with a whoosh of displaced air, and by so little a margin he was sure he could feel its heat, was all he needed to be convinced. "Gun captains, load with canister and double charges. To press your elevation, then you too retire from the point of danger behind the screen of the bullocks. Mr. Harbin, you and I will take over the lanyards."
"Sir?"
"Robert Shaw, I want the men with sledgehammers standing by and 2 more of those metal spikes." That got a touch of the forelock and an
"Aye, aye, sir."
"And get everything onto those carts and set them alight." Pearce got himself and Harbin as far away from the guns as he could, which was just as well, because the French finally got the range and powder charge right, and a ball took one of them on the muzzle, sending it flying with a ringing sound and cracking the cast-iron casing of the barrel. "Mr. Harbin, you are now redundant, sir. Get back." Pearce was watching the column of soldiers advance. It was an untidy formation, no doubt made more so by the uneven ground. A glance behind him showed the carts beginning to burn, Harbin disobeying his orders and holding a spike, looking like a dwarf beside the man with the sledgehammer, and in the hollow his sailors were running for dear life. Dilnot's men were strung out in a line, muskets at the ready, waiting for him. His judgment of range was pure guesswork. He might have discussed ballistics with HMS Weasel's miser of a gunner, but he was still an ignoramus in that department. So as the column reached the halfway point between his position and their own, he pulled the lanyard more in hope than in anger. The cannon actually jumped clear of the ground as the double charge went off, spewing hundreds of metal balls in the direction of the French troops. The damage it did was immense. The man in charge of the assault, a fellow with his hat on his sword and a tricolour sash round the waist of his black coat, took the eye of the salvo, hit with so many balls that he was tossed about like a rag doll. The effect behind him was equally telling as men fell, were blown back, or dropped to the side. "Harbin," Pearce said as calmly as he could. "The spike." The boy rushed forward to a cannon now on its side, the crouched giant with him, and calmly placed the point in the touch-hole, this as another French ball ploughed up the earth no more than a dozen feet distant.
The clang of the two blows was an unspoken signal to Dilnot, who, though his enemies were at long range for musketry, opened up to let them know that the action was ongoing. Rushing past the blazing carts, and remembering they still had on them barrels of powder, Pearce cursed himself for forgetting that too. If they went off now, he, Harben, and the hammer-wielding sailor would be blown to perdition. The powder had the good grace to wait until they were clear, finally exploding in a deafening roar when they retired behind the men of the 11th Foot, who were firing, reloading, moving back 10 paces, and firing again as the remnant of that column came on to contest the ground, they too stopping to deliver volleys of musketry. And since the range was closing, those musket balls were whizzing past their ears. "Mr. Dilnot, undignified as it may appear, I think it is time to run." "After you, sir." Pearce nodded and obliged. It was only when he had gone 20 yards and he glanced back that he saw Dilnot had not moved. His men were running like the sailors, but the army lieutenant stood with his pistol in his hand, which he discharged as soon as he thought the range close enough. Then he took out his sword and waited. The shots Pearce aimed at him may have been heard, but they were ignored, and he had to flee himself or face the oncoming horde of bayonets. It was afterwards that he heard how Dilnot had charged those same weapons, his sword waving, until he fell on their sharp points, gaining for himself what he obviously intended from the outset, a hero's death.
"Well, I canna say I'm sorry, laddie," Elphinstone said as he read Pearce's report. "The man had disgraced himself, and now he is redeemed by his action."
"His foolish action, sir?"
"Don't go traducing military glory, Pearce. It's what we all live for."
"Dilnot died for it."
"He saved his name."
"Is his name that important?" Elphinstone leant forward to emphasize his words.
"It obviously was to him, and when his family hear how he died, they will be proud of him, and that is something. Better, I think, than being snubbed in the mess by his fellow officers refusing to talk to him."
Realizing he was wasting his time, Pearce said, "I'm sorry we lost the guns, sir."
"Who cares about them?"
Elphinstone barked happily.
"They were French, laddie. The more of them we lose, the better."
Chapter 6. Sitting in the thwarts of her morning transportation, Emily Barclay kept looking intently at Martin Dent as he worked the oars, dying to question him about his terming her nephew a toad, continually forced to look quickly away if he lifted his head. His quick excuses had done nothing to divert her curiosity. She might be a captain's wife, with the station and honour that carried, but she was not yet 19 years of age, and childhood jibes were not so distant that she could not recall their meaning. Toad was in no way a jocular, genial term. It was an appellation designed to wound and to call into question a person's character. She had, in her time, though she would blush to admit it now, used the expression herself. Emily had brought up the subject of that action in Brittany at dinner the day before, much to the chagrin of her husband, who hated to be reminded that he had lost the vessel in the first place, humbugged by a clever adversary. Even less that in an attempt to regain the Lady Harrington he had personally failed, suffering many casualties. Indeed, he had been close to despair, looking for ways to explain to authority, first of all, how he had lost a ship from the convoy he was tasked to escort, and secondly, why, in the face of standing orders not to do so, he had abandoned the rest of his charges to try and remedy the situation. Toby, sensing his captain's discomfort, sought to change the subject. His aunt insisted he tell his tale. She had heard the story before, of course. Toby had regaled her with it right after the event. The landing in the wrong place, that had seen the cutter wrecked and the commanding lieutenant drowned. The way her nephew had taken charge and formulated a bold plan to get the remnants of his party back to HMS Brilliant. How, outnumbered and outgunned, he and the brave men he had led retook the merchant ship from under the noses of her French captors.
Given that he must have told the tale many times since, it should have come out well rehearsed, which made surprising the stumbling explanation he now offered, until she realized it was the added presence of his captain which was causing the boy to falter, and it had nothing to do with uncomfortable recollection. The look she saw was one of skepticism, as though her husband knew what he was hearing was not the truth, while the interjections he made to clear up the odd point engendered in the youngster an air of deep discomfort, making him wriggle inside his clothing as though his entire skin itched. Instead of clearing up any doubts, her inquiry had only served to increase them, which left her with an even stronger desire to find out the truth. She could not ask Martin Dent for an explanation. That was impossible, given their differing stations. It was well into the morning, when sharing a cup of coffee with Lutyens, a person so close they were now on first-name terms, that she posed to him the question. "I cannot fathom why you are asking me, Emily. The merest hint of recollection will remind you that I was not present. Both you and I were treating the wounded from the other boats." "It's just that, having heard Martin Dent tell the tale, and having had my nephew reprise his version, I seem to see so many discrepancies as to make me wonder at who is being truthful. Battles, according to those I have questioned, are confusing affairs. After our ship was taken, I embarked on a quest to find out the truth of the action, and I have to say that not one account agreed with another." Emily Barclay waved an impatient hand. "It is not just the action itself of which I speak, but of that which happened before. According to Martin, once they found themselves stranded ashore, John Pearce was the prime mover in organizing them. In his telling, Pearce formulated the plan to retake the Lady Harrington and oversaw the execution. Yet if you hear my nephew Toby's account, all the decisions, however much he seems to wish to be modest, were made by him. Certainly my husband treated him as a hero when he came back aboard. If he did not think him so, he surely would not have given him the task of taking that very same vessel back to England." A surgeon on board a king's ship heard much that was not vouchsafed to commissioned officers, and that was doubly so in the case of someone like Lutyens, originally termed by the crew a right nosy Parker. Forever eavesdropping on the crew's conversations, or watching the men at their duties, never without one of his little notebooks to hand, he observed more than most. At first it engendered much distrust, but the men soon found that nothing he saw or heard went to the ears of authority, so slowly they had begun to trust him, and with that trust, as he treated the cuts, abrasions, and the occasional broken bone which were a daily part of shipboard life, there came a degree of disclosure. To begin with, the mess that termed themselves the Pelicans had not been popular with the crew. Pressed seamen rarely were, but their very collective defensiveness had singled them out for disdain. The first crack had been made by the Irishman, O'Hagan, fighting and beating the ship's bully boy fair and square. The next, when Ralph Barclay had overstepped the mark to punish John Pearce for merely admiring his wife. She had shown her displeasure at her husband's actions, and the crew had done so too, in a way that left the captain of the frigate no way of even acknowledging their active defiance. From that the Pelicans gained a degree of acceptance, and to have brought out a ship so recently captured, when Ralph Barclay's own attempt to do the same had so signally failed, could only enhance that regard. So many were sorry to see them go, bound for England and freedom. After their departure, the surgeon, treating the sailor Dysart for his broken arm and a head wound, was regaled with the true story of what happened in the estuary of the River Trieux by someone who had witnessed it, which differed substantially from that which had been claimed by Emily's nephew, and seemingly accepted as truth by his captain. Toby Burns was seen by the crew as a useless little turd long before that action, nervous of authority, as well as any notion of making a decision, the type that would see a man flogged rather than own up to an error. So it had come as no surprise to the crew of HMS Brilliant that he had demonstrated precisely those qualities when he found himself stranded on the French shore, nominally, because of his midshipman rank, the man in charge. Given a chance to prove himself as a naval officer, he had failed abysmally, displaying craven cowardice rather than leadership, a vacuum that John Pearce had more than adequately filled. Many members of the crew suspected Ralph Barclay must know more of the truth than he had ever let slip, and if he did, it rendered inexplicable his subsequent actions. Not one of the tars, much as they disliked the man, thought their captain a fool. He must, despite the boy's fairy tales, be able to see him as clearly as any common seaman. They did know he had been given cause to hate John Pearce, and speculation suggested he had taken the opportunity to rid himself of a man he saw as a pest, one he might not be able to tame, as well as one around whom discontent could fester. Toby Burns must have been given command of the Lady Harrington because he was a nephew by marriage, not for any competence or lies about personal bravery. Or did Ralph Barclay want rid of him too? But there was one certain fact. Having listened to all these truths and theories in confidence, that was something that had to be respected. "My dear Emily, I cannot see why you are troubling yourself with something which happened months ago." Now it was her turn to avoid disclosure. Not even to someone she saw as a close friend would she say that, on the truth, might hinge her attitude to her husband and her marriage. It might also impact on the way she saw a blood relative, for if indeed Toby Burns was a toad, then she might have no choice but to treat him as such. "I am a woman, Heinrich." "Explanation enough, my dear Emily," cried Lutyens happily, determined to change the subject. "Now, do you think we can do a round of our patients?" "As you requested, sir," said Ralph Barclay, "the copies of my muster books since I weighed from Sheerness." Copies there had to be. Every 3 months the logs and books of a serving vessel were sent off to the Admiralty and the Navy Board to be perused by penny-pinching clerks, men who earned more in a wage than serving officers. It was a wise captain who kept duplicates of everything, for when disputes arose about stores consumed or condemned, ropes and spars used, even the quantity of nails employed in repairs, which they did with depressing regularity, an officer needed the protection of his own accounts to argue his corner. "Good," said Hotham. "Now please be so good as to sit with my second secretary and identify those on the list you see as both knowledgeable and reliable." As yet unaware of what Hotham had in mind, he could do nothing but comply, and as he went through the crew of HMS Brilliant he put a small mark against those who had any knowledge of the impressment which had taken place at the Pelican, and another if he felt he could call on them for support. When pressing, a captain tended to use men who were able to obey orders, however unpleasant, and he was aided by the fact that he had, thanks to Admiral Hotham, at Lisbon managed a complete change of junior officers. Midshipman Fairmeadow was a worry. He would not see where his true interests lay if questioned, so he put a tick against his name. Toby Burns? The boy had not been present, but he was so deep in his uncle's debt he would answer as he was instructed. Devereux, a huge beetle-browed bully who was a follower of his, would say whatever he could to help his captain. Kemp, the rat-faced creature whom he knew hated Pearce, also got a double mark, and he put a question mark against one of the men he had taken aboard that night, though not from the Pelican, a slippery fellow called Gerson, whom, he had been told, was not at all a friend to those he messed with. Having completed his task, he went back to face Hotham, who had a quick glance at the book. "It is enough, I fancy, though I see here the name of one of your original lieutenants, Henry Digby." "I lost him at Lisbon, sir, if you recall." Hotham looked at him from under questioning eyebrows, but he did not point out Barclay had lost his 2 other lieutenants in that action off Brittany, one dead, the other so badly wounded he had been shipped to a shore hospital. "But he is here in Toulon. I put him into HMS Weasel, then shipped him out before Benton sailed for Corsica to do work ashore." Barclay's smile was one of gratitude. Hotham had sent Pearce off in that ship to deflect his demands, and he hoped he was looking to do the same again. The longer the matter could be delayed, the less likelihood, in a service which scattered its personnel continuously, there would be to have the number of witnesses required in one place.
"I dare say you are wondering, Berkeley, what I have in mind." "All I know, sir, is that whatever you intend, I will trust you to have a care for my reputation."
That piece of sycophancy was accepted by Hotham as his due, and now it was his turn to smile.
"I doubt I need to remind you of the case of Captain Bligh." "No, sir." "Or of Midshipman Thomas Haywood."
The connection was obvious. Haywood, one of the Bounty mutineers forcibly fetched back from Hawaii, had faced a court-martial, but he had powerful support from his uncle, Admiral Palsy, and he had the ear of the Admiralty and some influence at court. There was little doubt the boy was guilty, and indeed he had been found so by the court, only to be pardoned by the king. It was generally acknowledged that had Bligh been present to give evidence, it would have been so damning that Haywood would have hanged. So the powers that be made sure Captain Bligh was at sea when the court-martial took place, which allowed Haywood to escape his well-deserved fate, one faced by a trio of the ship's lower ratings.
"With Captain Benton gone," added Hotham, "I have a mind to see Mr. Digby promoted into the command of that French capture. He was, after all, the premier of HMS Weasel, albeit not aboard when she was taken." "With respect, sir, his commission is not one of long standing. Will not that put out of joint several more deserving officers, not least some on your own flagship?" "You are right to point that out, Berkeley, but I had in mind a temporary command on a particular service, the reason being that more experienced officers are required here at Toulon for the defence of the port. Since the duty is a tedious one, and there may well be hot action here, I think those officers you mentioned will be well satisfied with my decision. And if we man that vessel from HMS Brilliant, plus the waifs and strays from Leander, she will have complement enough to do what is required." "You are certain Sir Lord Hood intends to buy her in?" Hotham's face clouded at the interruption. "Lord Hood will do so if I request that he do so, and I shall." "Forgive me, sir. In my enthusiasm—" He left the sentence unfinished, because what Hotham intended was plain, merely adding, "Thank you, sir." "Brilliant!" shouted the coxswain to the quarterdeck of HMS Leander, identifying the captain of that vessel wished to come aboard. Having seen Ralph Berkeley's barge approach, Taberley, officer of the watch, had called for the half-dozen marines still aboard and every available midshipman to make their way to the entry port to greet him. The ship's captain was informed, but he would not stir for an officer of less seniority than himself. Indeed, the captain rarely stirred ever, content to leave his officers to run the ship and only come out at the sight of an enemy warship, problems, or defaulters. He was a man more concerned with his rare butterfly collection, and it was in fact unusual to find him aboard off a shore with so many species that were not native to England. "Sire," said Taberley, lifting his hat. The visitor did likewise, aiming it at the unseen quarterdeck of the ship and the flag on the mizzen. "Captain Berkeley." "Welcome aboard, sir. The captain has been informed of your visit, and I am sure would be happy to receive you in his cabin." That was a lie. Berkeley would be received, but with reluctance. "My compliments to the captain, but would you please explain to him I am here on a particular task, on the instructions of Admiral Hotham. He has requested that I fetch some men out of your ship so that he can have them interviewed. I must return to the flagship with all dispatch." "Of course, sir. Their names?" That got Taberley a small piece of paper, and when he saw the 4 names he was far from pleased. "I have to inform you, sir, 3 of these men are due a flogging, 2 dozen at the grating for insubordinate behaviour." "It will have to wait, Mr. Taberley, for Admiral Hotham will not. Please be so good as to fetch them to me." There was no option but to comply, and one of the mids was sent off on the duty, leaving Taberley and Berkeley together. It seems you have found them troublesome.
"It does not do to be so on this ship," Tabley barked. Then, realizing he was talking to a superior officer, he softened his tone. "The fellow Gerson is a very useful man, sir, and no trouble at all. I would say he would rise to a better rating if he applied himself, and given that he can read and write with a clear and elegant hand, and has two ahead for figures, it would be no surprise to see him as an assistant to a purser one day." Indeed. Barclay, reminding himself of Gerson's aversion to Pearce, took Tabley's arm and led him far enough away from the rest of the welcoming party to avoid his low question being overheard. "Would you say he was reliable?" Cornelius Gerson had done Tabley many favours, and by identifying O'Hagan as a pugilist of great ability just after they had weighed from Spithead, he had helped enliven what was slated to be a dull voyage, as well as filling the Tabley purse. Being the only one aware of the Irishman's prowess, he had cleaned out his fellow officers when they had arranged a bout with another known champion. Gerson collected a fair amount in winnings too, to add to the guineas which a grateful Tabley had paid to him. Such detail, of necessity, being illegal under the Articles of War, must remain secret, but the lieutenant knew nevertheless how to answer Barclay's question. "He is, sir, a man who knows where his duty lies in regard to discipline." Deciphering that was no trouble at all. It was authority speak for a man who would not take the part of his shipmates against those set over him. The four men, three rubbing red-raw wrists, sore from wearing irons, emerged from below, and it was clear from the distance the trio of defaulters kept from the blonde-haired fourth that they were not friendly. Ralph Barclay examined them with some interest, although he had seen them all before. The curly-haired, square-faced Irishman, O'Hagan, was too big, too much a creature of muscle to require real scrutiny. Which was Taverner and which Dommett he could not tell. One fair of hair, with a tricorn tipped back on his head in an insolent fashion, which went with his truculent expression, and the other a pallid-faced youngster of slim build and a passive eye. What they all had in common was the shock on their faces as they recognized their old captain. "Aboard my barge," he ordered, noticing the slight hesitation which had him looking hard at O'Hagan, who would doubtless be the leader of those in trouble. "I believe you are due 24. If you don't want that doubled, you will move instantly." Michael O'Hagan recognized the expression on Ralph Barclay's face, a scowl that made real his threat. The crew of Brilliant had said he was a hard horse captain, a bit free with the cat, though they had known worse. To Michael O'Hagan he was a downright bastard. The four men lowered themselves into the barge and crowded into the bow, and after another exchange of compliments, Barclay joined them, sitting in the thwarts and glaring forward. Soon his main attention shifted to Gerson, who had an absurdly handsome face, almost girlish given his petulant expression. A man who would inform on his shipmates, who could read and write in a clear hand, and knew his numbers, might be useful. John Pearce came to HMS Britannia unaware of why he had been summoned, and going below to tell Hotham's secretary that he was on board, he ran straight into Henry Digby. It was amusing to see, in a place of little natural light, his old divisional officer did not react until he spoke. "Lieutenant Digby, I am pleased to see you." Digby leant forward. "Do I know you, sir?" "You do indeed," said Pearce, lifting his hat. "Have we not served together?" Digby lifted his hat too, but his eyebrows seemed to go higher. "It cannot be you, Pearce." "It is." Digby's eyes took in his coat, his breeches, even his shoes, the whole so plainly the garb of a fellow lieutenant. "I feel it would be in order to explain." "Move your arse, lads. Admiral's got a quill-scratcher waiting." The loud voice made Pearce glance round, and Digby looked over his shoulder for the same reason, to see their old shipmates, 3 pelicans and that swine Gerson, being shepherded to another part of the Admiral's quarters. "Michael!" Pearce shouted. The Irishman turned, grinned, and shrugged his shoulders. Rufus waved. Charlie Taverner gave him a queer look, and Gerson glowered as they were ushered through a small glass-paned door. The rasping voice made them attend to the other man approaching. Digby tipped his hat. Pearce fingered his sword.
"Mr. Digby," said Ralph Barclay.
"Sir," Digby replied, "it seems I am to be subject to no end of surprises today."
"I will not address the person you are with."
"You will address me one day, Barclay, over any weapon you choose." Digby was shocked at the way Pearce addressed their one-time captain, still confused that someone he had last seen as a common seaman was now of the same rank as he, as well as wondering what it all portended. But at that moment he was called into the Admiral's day cabin. Barclay followed, leaving Pearce standing alone, unable to decide whether he was happy or fuming. He went to the door through which the 4 seamen had been ushered, and looked into the small glass panes to see Hotham's under-secretary with quill and a candle to light his papers, taking notes on the other side. Impulse made him open the door, which earned him a furious look from the scribe.
"Do you mind, sir? I am taking depositions from these men pending the forthcoming court-martial of Captain Barclay."
"Sorry," Pearce replied, immediately shutting the door. So he was going to get Barclay in the dock. That thought pleased him mightily, and much as he wanted to put a sword or a ball through him, John Pearce decided that the ruin of him must come first. Only when he had been shredded of his naval dignity would he challenge Barclay to the duel in which he would pay for the insults he had heaped on him.
"Mr. Digby, you are to take command of the vessel captured by HMS Weasel, now renamed HMS Pharaon. Your duty to escort 4 French 74s and some 5,000 seamen to the Atlantic ports from whence they came. They are a bunch of revolutionary vermin who will not accept orders from their commander. You are to have no consort with them or their officers. Your duty is merely to see them into their home ports and return here with all dispatch. You will be seconded by Lieutenant Pearce, and your crew will be made up with drafts from HMS Brilliant and HMS Leander. You will of necessity be short-handed, given that we need here every man who can be spared. But since I anticipate no action, that will not be a burden. In fact, it may make sure you are not tempted to go prize-hunting."
Digby had seen a great deal of Hotham. He had, for a short time, before being shifted to serve under the now-dead Benton, been one of the 8 lieutenants on this very ship, though given the superior attitude of his fellow officers, not least the Premier, it had been a far from happy experience.
"I must point out, Mr. Digby, that this is a temporary appointment. You will know from your own date of commission that you lack the seniority for such a position. Yet Captain Barclay here has told me you are a competent officer."
Digby had to nod his thanks to Ralph Barclay, but he wondered at the words. He had the impression that he was not much liked by the captain of HMS Brilliant, as well as the knowledge that the feeling was mutual, something he had been obliged to disguise on seeing him again.
"It will, of course," Barclay said smoothly, "enhance your record. After all, having through circumstance served as my Premier, such a commission as this can do you no harm."
Why did he not believe him? And how the hell could John Pearce, who from the earlier showing was a mortal enemy of this man, be an officer fit to serve under him? It did not smell good, and the temptation to exercise his right to decline the commission was strong. He felt he was being set up for a fall. Yet if he did decline, he would look in vain for advancement elsewhere. The word would spread, and being as lowly as he was in rank, he could think of no gloss he could put on such a rebuff to Hotham that would make it sound like a correct response.
"Please proceed aboard the prize, Mr. Digby. My secretary has your commission on his desk as well as your orders. Check your water and wood, and indent the Toulon arsenal for stores, powder and shot, and any cordage and canvas you require. Captain Barclay will send over your crew at once. I want you prepared to weigh within 24 hours.
"Sir!"
And, Mr. Digby, on your way out, please ask Lieutenant Pearce to come in."
Chapter 7.
"You must understand, Pearce, that if I am going to sanction a court-martial on an officer of the standing of Captain Barclay, It has to be properly prepared, and that will take time."
Pearce, sitting opposite Hotham, was wondering where the man in question had gone. Berkeley had entered the cabin with Digby, but he had not exited, and there was no sign of him being present now. But then there was more than one door to the spacious area occupied by an admiral. He had come in with Hotham's secretary on his heels, and that fellow was now taking notes.
"Are you attending to what I am saying, sir?"
Hotham barked. Pearce said sorry before he felt it to be feeble. Apologizing to anyone who claimed authority always made him feel that way.
"Good. As I was saying, Captain Berkeley is an officer who is highly regarded in many quarters, and that of which you are accusing him could put a serious blight on his career. I cannot see busy officers of the required rank rushing to sit in judgment on him, and I do not look forward to putting pressure on them to attend."
"I was rather hoping, sir, that since pressing men who are not seamen is illegal under the law of the land, it might lead to a criminal prosecution in front of a judge of the King's Bench."
"You are showing an unbecoming degree of bile, sir."
That made John Pearce sit forward and raise his voice. "I was, sir, taken by force from a location that made his actions doubly illegal. In short, the liberties of the Savoy." Hotham's face took on a look of pure distaste.
"I will not ask what you were doing in such a disreputable place, Mr. Pearce."
"Which only confirms to me, sir, that you know of it. Know that no bailiff is allowed within its boundaries, and certainly no naval officer intent on seeking men. The whole area is protected by ancient statute. Might I add that not only were myself and more than a dozen others taken from there, but we were then subject to a treatment that could only be called, at the very least, common assault."
"I must say,"
the secretary cut in, having seen Hotham close to an explosion,
"you seem very knowledgeable on the law."
"Having been hounded by the so-called law for a fair degree of my life, sir, that is essential. If I may continue—" Hotham slammed his hand on the table.
"Enough! My secretary will take your deposition in writing, the same as is being done to those you claim are your companions. But we are not here for that. We are here to discuss your next commission."
"Whatever it is, I will probably decline it."
"Then, sir, I must tell you that your companions in your claimed misfortune will be returned to HMS Leander forthwith, where I am informed they are due to face punishment."
"What kind of punishment?" Hotham looked at Pearce as if he was a fool, and in truth it was a damned silly remark. There were options on punishment, but the way the Admiral had said it, it could only be a flogging. He suppressed the temptation to inquire the nature of the offence. It made little difference to those who would suffer.
"However, should you accept to serve under Lieutenant Digby aboard the prize taken by HMS Weasel, now HMS Pharaon, I will release them into your charge to serve aboard that vessel for the duration of the commission."
The wording of that was interesting. Hotham could not bring himself to say, as he no doubt would to any other officer, that Pearce, as the officer in command, had taken the prize. Yet it was the truth. He had only been part of it, knowledge of which lessened what was no doubt intended as a slight. As to the options he had, they were zero. He could not abandon his friends to an unknown number of strokes from the cat, or deny them the chance to get away from the harsh regime they were presently under. "And the duty, sir?"
"I do not think it is my place to inform you of that. I would not dream of interfering with the prerogatives of a master and commander. Ask Mr. Digby."
"And the date for the court-martial?"
"Yet to be decided, but not before your return, which I anticipate will not be more than 1 calendar month."
Pearce looked at the scribbling secretary to ensure he was writing that down, and Hotham added,
"By that time matters should have settled here in Toulon, and the officers can be spared from other duties to see to the matter. Now go with my secretary and make a deposition, which the person who volunteers to defend Captain Berkeley can read." "You are Gerson, are you not?"
The man was standing well away from the 3 others with whom he had been fetched aboard, and he looked, Ralph Berkeley thought, angry enough to spit. The reason was simple, though Ralph Berkeley had no knowledge of it. He had not been taken out of the Pelican like the others.
He had been fetched out of a roaring River Thames, having been chucked off London Bridge by a pair of ruffians hired to pay him back for his sins, both carnal and fiscal. The city alderman who had engaged those brutes had been his employer. The man's wife, a much younger creature, often left alone while her husband was out on his pleasures or his duties, had succumbed to the Gerson charm and become his lover. She had also opened her household account to him, and when that was added to the money which he stole in his capacity as the alderman's bookkeeper, young Gerson had enjoyed a comfortable existence, dressing well and eating and drinking his fill. It had ended that night, as, stripped of everything but his shirt, he had hit the freezing water of the Thames, which was like a tidal race as it came through the arches of the bridge, sure he was going to drown. That he had landed right by a naval cutter was pure chance, and with men of strength aboard they had hauled him in and fetched him aboard their frigate. In telling his tale to the clerk the quartet had just left, he had been informed that his case against the man before him was specious. His impressment, as a body saved from certain death by being fished out of the river, was legal.
"Answer me, fellow."
The soft voice, so unusual, made Gerson look up at his old captain. There was no affection in the look of either man, but there was curiosity.
"I spoke with Mr. Taberley when I came to fetch you. He tells me you write with a clear hand and you know your numbers."
"What if I do?" Gerson demanded, clearly suspecting a trap. Ralph Barclay had to hold himself back from cuffing the insolent sod. He would not take that kind of tone from any rating.
"Tell me, Gerson, what is your opinion of John Pearce?"
"Why do you want to know?"
"Sir!"
Gerson lost his arrogance and seemed to shrink, touching his forelock with an expression of abject alarm. The man questioning him was an officer with years of experience, so he immediately put him down as a physical coward, which, oddly, acted for, not against him. "Pearce thinks he's God's gift." He indicated the other three men, standing well away and looking at the exchange with deep interest, and Gerson's voice rose so they could hear. "Which might work for those fools yonder, but it don't for me. Pearce is naught but mutton dressed as lamb, and he was that before he donned that blue coat." Ralph Barclay saw the man O'Hagan clench his fists, and he knew if he had not been present, Gerson would have paid for that outburst. He kept his voice deliberately low as he responded.
"Then you are in for a hard time, man. As of today you will be under his command."
"Never! I'll run rather than suffer that." Ralph Barclay laughed.
"To where? Into the arms of the Revolution, perhaps?"
"Somewhere. Anywhere."
"I have to say that I feel sorry for you, Gerson. So I'm going to make you an offer. I sailed from England without a clerk to keep my papers in order."
He was not prepared to admit it had been brought on by penury. He put down a relative's name and pocketed the money a clerk would have been due as a captain's servant.
"So I have a position free for a fellow with the right abilities. If you agree, I will have you transferred back to HMS Brilliant and give you the position I have just mentioned. It'll be temporary, but if you apply yourself with diligence, it can be yours permanently. At least you will not have to sail under Pearce."
Gerson, whose eyes had widened as Ralph Barclay spoke, positively grovelled, trying to take his hand to kiss it.
"Belay that man! Pick up your dunnage and go to the entry port. My barge is standing off. Call it in and get aboard."
"Your Honour."
"One more thing, Gerson. I expect that when I face the court-martial being forced on the Admiral by Pearce, you will bear witness to the truth."
"Happily, Captain, happily." "Might I ask who has taken on the task of defending Barclay?" Hotham's secretary corrected him immediately. "Captain Barclay, and the answer is no one yet, though I anticipate there will be many who will put themselves forward. Am I free to go?" The secretary lifted up the several pages of writing which was Pearce's written evidence and made a show of looking at it. He then proffered a quill and the last sheet to be signed, which John Pearce did with a flourish. A languid hand indicated that he should depart, and as he came out onto the main deck, he saw Barclay ending his conversation with Gerson, saw the treacherous sod pick up the small ditty bag that contained his possessions and head for the entry port, giving Michael O'Hagan a wide berth. Looking back, Gerson saw Pearce as well, and the gloating look on his face made Pearce wonder what the bastard was up to now. Barclay had turned and re-entered the door from which he had no doubt exited, leaving Pearce to walk over to his friends. "Michael, Rufus, Charlie." As their hands moved to touch their foreheads, he barked, "Don't you dare!" "Sure," said Michael, grinning. "It's only for show, John boy." "Are we free?" asked Charlie. "Not free, no. At least not yet." That made Charlie frown. He was always the most vocal of their plight, and the one inclined to remind Pearce of his previous failures to get them free. "But you are to have the misfortune of serving under me, and I am about to serve under our old lieutenant, Mr. Digby." O'Hagan's face lit up. All his teeth were visible. "Holy Mother of God, John!
After what we have had, it sounds like free to me."
"Then pick up your bags. I must go to the officer of the watch and request a boat."
"Will we be free, John?" asked Rufus.
"If it can be done, we four will do it. There's going to be a court-martial on Barclay when we return, so the sooner we get moving, the sooner that might be. Now come along." They were all grinning as they responded, "Aye, aye, sir." Looking at the up-to-date muster book, Ralph Barclay was seeking those men it would be best to send into the prize. Sykes, his boatswain, he would like to have sent, but the movement of a ship's standing officers, boatswain, gunner, carpenter, and purser, was not within his powers, and the man would hardly volunteer to go into a ship half the size of his present warrant. Still, he could ask. For the rest, it would be the standing officer's assistants who would get the nod, though he had a care to keep with him those who he thought he could call as witnesses in his defence. At another table, Gerson was examining the rest of the ship's books, which told of what stores HMS Brilliant carried, had a record of what she had consumed in a list of articles that ran into the hundreds. Having raided the Toulon arsenal, the ship was well found in everything, and Gerson was looking for those gaps where he could purloin a bit, something to set aside which he could sell should the occasion arise. He would need the connivance of the correct members of the crew. Only the gunner had access to powder, a valuable commodity. Likewise the carpenter with timber and tools. The purser would have his own peccadilloes, so there it was a case of finding out what he was up to and hoping that a little would fall his way. Canvas, cordage, and lifting tackle was an impossibility. Sykes, the boatswain, was too honest. The man who had employed him thought he had the measure of Gerson. He knew he would try to cheat him, all clerks did, just like the servants at home in Frome. But for a man who needed to be careful of his purse before taking up this command, indeed one who had the tipstaff banging their staff of office on his door, it took a canny soul to bamboozle him. Let Gerson try. That would at least bear some testimony to his competence. But he would be brought up with a round turn and told in no uncertain terms that the proceeds from anything purloined must be shared, and must be done in a way no Admiralty clerk could spot. The knock on the door admitted Midshipman Fairmelow, gangly and fair and somewhat in terror of his commanding officer.
"Mr. Fairmelow, we have orders to remain at this berth, which will be the death of an enthusiast like yourself. I have therefore agreed that you should have a temporary shift to HMS Pharaon. It's that French prize you saw come in. Mr. Digby commands her, and she is off on a cruise. Much more suitable than languishing here, what?"
If Ralph Barclay had not been so cheerful, Fairmelow would have accepted with the grace that was clearly expected. But smiling good news was not his captain's habit, so his response was mumbled.
"I want you to sort out the following men. Gerson, take note of these names. Costello, Dysart, Dent, both the Kempshalls, Dorling, Lanky Smith."
The names were reeled off, with Fairmelow wondering how Gerson had got to be where he was. Mind, he was a useless bugger on deck, from what the midshipman could recall, so he was probably better off here.
"Tell them to get their dunnage together and be prepared to shift."
Ralph Barclay stared at the deck before him,
and sifted through troubled thoughts. His boatswain was a real problem, since he could be called to give evidence.
"Send Mr. Sykes to me, if you please."
Toby Burns knocked and entered. "Mrs. Barclay approaching, sir."
"See you round aboard, Mr. Burns. I am busy."
Cornelius Gerson was looking hard at a set of figures, but he was not really reading them now. He had forgotten the captain's delicious wife, and the thoughts he was harbouring as he recalled her would have seen him chucked overboard. She was very young compared to her husband. He never even considered that such actions had got him into trouble before. That had been someone else's fault, not his. This was, quite possibly, going to be a bit of better good fortune than he had at first surmised. When she entered the cabin and made what was memory dull by the reality of her presence, he felt his blood race.
"Don't stare, Gerson, it lacks manners."
Barclay's rebuke had him looking at his books again, but an introduction had him on his feet.
"My dear, allow me to name Cornelius Gerson. I have engaged him to be my clerk."
"I know your face, Mr. Gerson," said Emily. He nearly blurted out that he knew hers, but he forced himself into an obsequious nod.
"He was one of my Sheerness volunteers, my dear, and damn me—"
Seeing the look that minor blasphemy brought to his wife's face, he looked contrite, yet thinking it was a burden to be with sailors one minute and a wife of strict manners the next.
"Anyway, I had no idea he was accomplished in the clerkish line, but now I do."
"Is this to be his place of work, husband?" "Please," thought Gerson, unaware of why the question had been posed. It was because of Ralph Barclay's sailor servant, Shenton, who had been with him for years of bachelorhood, and had not taken kindly to his master having his wife aboard. He was, to Emily Barclay, a nuisance, never knocking when he should, and in his own subtle way letting it be known that he saw her as an interloper. Another person with unrestricted access to this cabin was not to be welcomed.
"No, my dear, we will find him a crib in which he can work."
Another knock and Sykes entered.
"You sent for me, sir."
There was a terrible temptation to scowl at the man. Sykes was competent, but lacked the necessary fire, being a bit soft on the hands, and Ralph Barclay had to rebuke him more than once for what he saw as Sykes mollycoddling them, which always produced a look of injury. But it would not do. He had to look gracious. A quick explanation followed in the same vein as that given to Fairmelow, with the captain unaware that by now everyone on the ship knew what was afoot.
"I just wonder if the experience will be better than sitting here, Sykes, when we are fully rigged and only the odd bit of grease or tar needed to keep us shipshape. I can tell you we will not weigh until Toulon is either secured or abandoned, and I know that Mr. Digby could use a capable man."
The alacrity with which the offer was accepted quite offended the giver. The man might at least have pondered. But then he didn't know how much Sykes disliked him, nor had his mind moved at the same speed. The boatswain could go on a detached duty, but his place aboard the frigate was secure. No one but Lord Hood could take it from him, and even if he did, Sykes could appeal above the C&C's head to the Navy Board.
"Very decent of you, sir, and I thank you for your consideration."
There was a terrible temptation to do the same to Brilliant's master, who was a useless, timid sod. But that would be a step too far.
"Right, Sykes. Ask Mr. Glaister to join me. We must work out some revised watch lists."
"And, Mr. Digby, I have to inform you that I lack the knowledge to do the task for which I have been selected." Digby had listened with increasing disbelief as Pearce had outlined his adventures of the last 6 months, since he had seen him go over the side of HMS Brilliant off the Brittany coast, already having seen action. To be pressed once was bad enough. To be pressed twice was hellish. Yet there was also a strand of envy mixed up with wonder at the amount of conflict Pearce had seen. It was the stuff of a junior officer's dreams. The man, despite his insistence on naming other people as responsible for what success he had enjoyed, seemed touched by some divine providence in the article of opportunity. To help in the capture of a French 74, which might have sunk a British 50, was fantastic.
"Might I suggest that you seek the appointment of another officer?"
That was tempting. To have as his second-in-command someone of so little experience was bound to place an extra burden on him, and it was not as if Pearce wanted it. What he asked next was what killed the notion.
"I would, of course, want O'Hagan, Taverner, and Dommett released into my care."
Digby was quite brusque. Pearce ashore and close to Berkeley, with that trio to aid him, was too risky to be considered. The man might not be beyond secret murder, and where would that leave him?
"I must decline both requests, Mr. Pearce. We've been given a duty to perform, and it is up to us to execute that to the best of our ability. Now you will cease to be so unconstructive, and help me to work out how we're going to fill the various offices that must be occupied. Not one of the men Captain Berkeley proposes to send us, apart from Mr. Sykes and Costello, has a true rating over able seamen, and we are still short of a master, and probably another midshipman."
"Then can I suggest, sir, you request that they should come from HMS Weasel? Mr. Neame, you must know, is an excellent master, and Harbin I rate very highly." Digby was nodding slowly, while Pearce was thinking that with those two aboard, some of his inexperience could be disguised. "Oh, and my Pelicans have requested that we ask for a couple of hands from Leander.
Their names are Latimer and Blubber Booth, both good men who can hand, reef, and steer." "I will see what I can do, but we must show some haste, for there is much to be taken aboard in terms of stores. We have to be ready to weigh by this time tomorrow."
Chapter 8. Coming aboard the newly commissioned HMS Pharaon, Lieutenant Digby was greeted by the boy who had brought her in, Midshipman Harbin, who was immediately asked if he was prepared to stay aboard. It was telling that he hesitated, pointing out that his ship was HMS Weasel, and only assented when he heard from where the recommendation had come, and that the same fellow who made it would be joining them. Fairmeadow came aboard with the draft from Ralph Berkeley, and though he seemed a personable enough lad, the mention of that same officer produced a dramatically different result. The notion of Lieutenant John Pearce sharing the same deck did not please him at all.
"Mr. Sykes at your service, sir, and right glad to see you again. Captain Berkeley has agreed that I may serve on your ship on this commission, if that is acceptable to you."
"Acceptable, Mr. Sykes? It is damned handsome,"
Digby replied, not willing to say what he really thought, that it was damned odd.
"It is only because he has orders to keep our ship in the inner harbour with enough men to man the guns, a floating battery, so to speak. Admiral Hood intends to keep Johnny Crapo honest. Any sign of backsliding, and it's a cannonball through the windows."
Digby raised an eyebrow, not at the notion, which was sound, but at the easy way that Sykes talked of it. Surely such a thing should be in the nature of a secret. Mind, he had never ceased to be surprised at the way sailors found out things that should not be vouchsafed to them. Keeping a secret aboard a ship was something generally held to be well-nigh impossible, unless the captain was so close-mouthed he told no one of any action he contemplated.
"Then you will know, Mr. Sykes, of our intended duty."
The bull-necked boatswain grinned, reminding Digby that, with the exception of his dealings with Ralph Berkeley, the man had a habit of general good cheer.
"Oh, Port and Fleet knows that by now, Your Honour."
"Then the whole fleet will also know how much time we have to complete our stores. Best get to work, Mr. Sykes, and I suggest you start by inspecting how we are fixed in the article of canvas and cordage."
Sykes gave instructions to the men with whom he had come aboard, and Digby greeted each one he could remember by name as they passed him, pleased that they seemed content to be coming aboard his ship, then immediately concerned that the reason could be that they might see him as soft.
"Mr. Fairmeadow, I have here a list of stores compiled after the ship's capture. Please be so good as to go below and ensure it is accurate."
Fairmeadow looked at the sheet and pointed out that it was dated not more than a week past, to which Digby replied,
"Time enough for tempted fingers to diminish it substantially. I need to know precisely what to request from the storehouse ashore, and I would not dare start off short."
"Mr. Pearce approaching, sir," called Harbin.
"Very good, Mr. Harbin.
See to Mr. Fairmelow, tell him where to stow his dunnage, and then report back to me."
Digby was suddenly aware that the approach of Pearce, with the 3 other pelicans in the thwarts, had taken everyone's attention. In fact, no one was doing anything. In a voice that was heard in half the ships in the anchorage, he yelled at them to "Get a move on!" and was pleased by the response, forced to turn away to hide his smile. Men were rushing to their duty. He might be remembered a considerate soul, but he was not going to be thought lenient.
"Sure, that's a fair old roar, John boy," said Michael O'Hagan. "Are you sure it was Digby?"
The men on the oars, all from Hotham's flagship, looked at each other to register their surprise, not for the first time, that a common seaman should address an officer so.
"That, Michael, is the voice of one in command, and if you think it loud, wait till you hear me. I think you'll be surprised."
O'Hagan laughed out loud.
"Jesus, never! Did I not tell you once that I thought you were made for a blue coat?" "And I saw you as a positive tyrant," added Charlie Taverner, with just a trace in his voice that the remark was not wholly tongue-in-cheek.
Pearce knew he had a problem with these 3. Probably he would have a problem with the crew he was about to face, because they knew him more as one of their own than as an officer. He had been gnawing on how to deal with it, and come to the conclusion that it would find its own level, for he could not behave in any other way than his conscience dictated. If any act of his caused offence, so be it, but now was as good a time as any to lay down a marker. "I have learnt, my friends, a ship must run smooth, that there is no place for laxity, for the sea will surely take you if you do not treat it with respect, and so will an enemy. I hope you too have absorbed this lesson."
"I don't know what you mean," said young Rufus.
Charlie's voice had no humour now.
"It means, Rufus, that when John Pearce shouts shit, the likes of us jump on the shovel."
"Stow it, Charlie," Michael responded as the boat came alongside. He was already following Pearce through the gangway when he added, "John boy will not become a Bartley just because he has the dress, but obey him we must if he asks us to."
"It'll be hard, Michael."
"I do not recall it so. I seem to remember we was happy to follow his lead when we were last in real trouble." The reference to Brittany made Charlie Taverner shut up.
"Oh, that'll be a damn rum vessel of no error,"
said the man coxing the Britannia's boat as they pulled clear.
"Paddy's market by the sound of it. It never heard the like. Disputing with an officer like that. Navy's going to the dogs."
"Mr. Pearce," said Digby, responding to the raised hat, "I welcome you aboard, though I have a feeling it should be the other way round." Pearce did not want to think of that, nor of Digby occupying quarters the like of which had so recently been his own.
"I hope you recall our old shipmates, sir." "That I do, Mr. Pearce, and I welcome you aboard also. I have sent in a request to the flagship to be allowed to warp into the mole to take on stores, so we will need the boats manned as soon as that is given. Please be so good as to tell Mr. Sykes this will be his next task after he has checked the sail lockers and the cable tier."
"Aye, aye, sir." As they made for the companionway, Digby called Pearce back to him and said quietly, "I know, sir, you have an attachment to these fellows that exceeds the bounds of normal duty, and while I respect it, I cannot allow it to interfere with the running of the ship. I know of the problem, sir, as I know that it is one with which I will have to deal. Let me say with some sincerity, it would not please me if that problem were to become mine." It was a sight easier to load stores from the mole than from boats or floating hoys, though there was no other way to bring aboard water, which was being pumped by hose from the seaward side, each barrel assembled from staves by the cooper, then sealed as much as was possible when full. It was damp work, but since the day was warm it was also pleasant, better than just hauling on ropes to hoist in beef and pork from the carts on the shore, so the men shifting the water barrels were rotated with others, so that the tasks were shared out evenly. Digby did not drive the men with harsh words, but encouraged them with orders dressed as requests, and both Pearce and Robert Sykes took their cue from him. They carried the same weight as barked commands, but were not resented. Ralph Barclay was on his poop, a glass to his eye, watching the progress of the work, unsure if he should be pleased or resentful that it seemed to be going smoothly. Occasionally he could see Pearce, and on more than one occasion the man was laughing, either at some remark he had made or a response he had received from the men of whom he was in charge.
Unbecoming. Damned unbecoming.
Sir?
Barclay turned to see Midshipman Toby Burns beside him, small, his face a mass of adolescent spots, his eyes full of what could only be trepidation.
You sent for me, sir?
The glass went back to Barclay's eye.
So I did. I wish you to proceed to yonder ship, the French capture, and ask Mr. Digby if he would get a dine with Mrs. Barclay and I tonight. And Burns, I wish you to make a point of issuing that invitation in the hearing of that blackguard Pearce.
With respect, sir, could I decline the duty and send another?
What?
Inside a uniform coat still too big for him, though less so than when he had first donned it, Toby Burns was trembling at the prospect. It was too easy to recall the silence that had allowed Pearce and his friends to be pressed for a second time, when a word from him could have saved them. The cold threats John Pearce had issued at their last encounter, to pay him back for his duplicity, were potent enough to terrify him.
With respect, sir?
Damn your respect, sir! Give me one good reason why I should accede to such a foolish request.
The quiver in the boy's voice was unmistakable.
On our last encounter, sir, in strict obedience to your orders, should the Lady Harrington meet a king's ship in soundings, I fear I made an enemy of Pearce by making no attempt to interfere with his being pressed again. Had I done so, I am sure he and his companions would have retained their liberty. I have no doubt that, should the opportunity present itself, he will seek to exact revenge for my actions.
If you obeyed me, Mr. Burns, you have naught to fear.
Bollocks, the boy thought, blushing at the mere notion that this uncle by marriage might discern his silent disagreement. Ralph Barclay had made it plain when he sent the Lady Harrington away that such an encounter was very possible, and also that it was one which would please him. But he had not been within sight of the coast of England, had not seen the look in Pearce's eye at being so close to freedom, and having it taken away by another king's officer, had not heard the way the words had been delivered, promising deadly retribution to a youngster whose life he had saved. And it was not just Pearce who felt betrayed by him, but that huge Irishman, O'Hagan.
Lieutenant Pearce,
Ralph Barclay interrupted the boy again.
Please do not grace him with that rank in my presence, Mr. Burns.
I was about to say, sir, that the fellow has no knowledge of my return to HMS Brilliant, and if I could keep it so, I would be grateful.
Saying that, Burns had reminded Ralph Barclay of why he had got shot of the little bugger in the first place, it being too good an opportunity to miss. Quite apart from being useless and, from what he had heard about the action in the Trier estuary, more than a touch shy, he was Emily's nephew, and that complicated the relationship between them. He could not as easily chastise her cousin as he could another mid, and the boy was a whimperer. God, the little sod looked as though he could burst into tears right now.
Very well, Mr. Burns. Go and ask Shenton to deliver my message.
I am grateful, sir, so grateful.
Get on with it, boy,
snapped Ralph Barclay, once more training his telescope on the toiling figures both on Digby's deck and on the mole. Burns rushed into the cabin, for Shenton was not in his pantry, to find his aunt sitting there at her embroidery. What was it about the look she gave him that was so different, not the kindly smile he had come to expect?
"I've been sent to find Shenton, Aunt Emily."
She was now looking intently at her stitching. "I believe you will find him with the cook."
"Thank you,"
Burns called as he rushed out. Emily lifted her head then and looked at the open skylight no more than a few feet above her head, through which she had heard every word of the exchange between her husband and her nephew. What orders had the former given that had left Toby in terror of John Pearce? Again, what was so different from her perception of what had taken place, as against the reality? The sharp stab of the needle into her finger was almost deliberate, and as she sucked on the blood it produced, tasting the salt, Her thoughts were more uncomfortable than any puncture of the skin.
"I fear I must decline Captain Barclay's kind offer, Shenton. Admiral Hotham has requested that we be ready to weigh tomorrow, and I dare not disobey such a command. Do, however, convey my gratitude to the captain and his wife, and say should my duty permit on another occasion I would be happy to accept."
Daft sod, thought Shenton, who knew his master better than anyone, having served with him through good times and bad since he was first made post. Shenton prided himself on knowing how his captain's mind worked. He had issued the invitation to Digby, but his look had been fixed on Pearce, so the upstart should not mistake the message. The invite did not extend to him. As for Digby, would he guess at Ralph Barclay's ploy? The newly promoted master and commander was never expected to accept. It was only a way to send an insult to John Pearce. "My compliments to your master," said Digby, "but we must get back to our task." They were still working after the sun went down, lanterns hoisted into the rigging, dinner taken for officers and men almost in between assignments, not resented by the lower ranks for being a shared experience. Until near 10 of the clock, Henry Digby could pronounce himself satisfied as he looked over his untidy decks. He was, with the exception of that, ready for sea. "The decks?" Pearce asked, knowing it was his duty to do so, for they were in an unholy state. Digby replied in a voice loud enough to be heard from taffrail to bowsprit, "Can wait till the morning, Mr. Pearce, and I think an extra tot of rum for the men would be in order." "I fear it will have to be brandy, sir," Pearce said. "This is, after all, in the article of spirituous liquor, a French ship." "Brandy it is then, Mr. Pearce. But do not ever say such a thing again. This is a king's ship, an English king's ship." "With respect, sir, I think our vessel is British."
"Well said,"
came a voice from nearby, which Pearce recognised as that of another Scot, Dysart. Digby frowned at the remark, then actually laughed.
"Well, will a couple of prickly jocks take a French drink with me?"
"Most happily, sir." Digby added quietly, "Pearce, remind me to indent the fleet's storeship for some rum tomorrow. Should the crew become fractious, brandy will not serve. It's bad enough having wine instead of beer." It was typical of the King's Navy, or at least of the senior officers who ran it, to insist on haste when none was necessary. Digby had worked his new crew hard, yet when they warped out into the anchorage and began to put the decks in order, no instructions came to do anything. Mr. Neame had come aboard at first light, and as soon as the ship was away from the mole he declared it so far down on the stern as to be close to dangerous, which involved a great deal of shifting of the stores already stowed. This took place while the master and the captain stood off in a boat examining the change in trim, while Pearce had the unenviable task of telling everyone what to do. Not that it mattered. They found that the ships they were designated to escort had not yet even been cleared of their cannon, powder, and shot. It was in musing on that fact, once the captain and master were back on board, which caused Pearce to call into question what their ship could do if any one of the French 74s decided the course they were supposed to steer could be changed.
"You have a point there, Pearce," Digby replied. "If we cannot coerce them, our only reason for being along is to ensure they are not impeded, which is, I suspect, the way the Admiral's mind is working. We need the means to invoke a degree of fear as well."
"A couple of carronades would serve, sir. Since they are to have nothing but signal guns, we would have the ability to come right up to pistol shot and put a ball in their hull." "I have to confess, Mr. Pearce, to never having seen a carronade in action, and only on the odd occasion one loaded in dumb show." That was a telling admission, and an admirable one.
"Then let me tell you, sir, I have, and they are a fearsome weapon. The scantlings of even a 74-gun ship of the line will not stand sustained fire from that weight of shot at close range. I shall put a request in to the Admiral. If he agrees, they must come from a ship which at present has them aboard. It is not a cannon we would find in the Toulon arsenal. given the French don't have them. Mr. Harbin, fetch me the senior gunner and the acting carpenter. If we can get a pair, I need to know where we can sight them." Watching the exchange, when the two acting warrants engaged in the discussion, Pearce could see Digby almost caressing the ship, and insisting on a clear opinion from his inferiors, evidence that he had already formed an almost physical bond of the kind he had already observed in other vessels. It was in the nature of sailors to love their ships, and to talk of them in familiar terms, not surprising in such a superstitious setting, and also one that, if it failed to float, left little to look forward to but drowning.
"He seems a good man, John boy,"
whispered Michael O'Hagan, who had come alongside.
"I think he is nothing like Barclay, Michael."
"Holy Mother of God, I hope there is only one of that stripe."
"Sadly, my friend, I doubt there is, and you know as well as I do, because we've been told there are worse."
"Then we will be well out of it."
"We will."
"Charlie and Rufus want to know when that might be."
"Not you?" O'Hagan grinned.
"Me too."
"When we return here, there will be a court-martial on Barclay, and I have no doubt it will find our case as proven. The evidence is overwhelmingly in our favour. You will then be within your rights to demand transport back to England."
"And you?"
"I will come with you, of course."
"I wonder, John boy. I have watched you this last day, and it seems to me you are happy in what you are doing."
Pearce was guarded. Michael was touching on thoughts he had harboured himself. So much had happened since his sudden, unwarranted elevation. The packet that had brought him from Portsmouth to Gibraltar had been commanded by the sterling Captain McGann, who insisted that a naval career was not a bad one for a man who had no idea for any other. After Corsica, with Benton dead, he had sat in the main cabin as a captain, and enjoyed the feeling of being in command of men who looked up to him, not least the freckle-faced Harbin. But the crew, buoyed with the success of the recent action, had shown a marked degree of respect for his office, and that too had been pleasant. "I will make the best of what I have while I have it." Discomfited by the point Michael was making, he called to the other midshipman aboard. "Mr. Fairmelow, if you please."
"Sir?"
said the mid, his face far from happy. Though he had worked as hard as any other to load the ship, he had done his best not to get close to Pearce or any of the others he had helped to press from the Pelican Tavern. He knew from being aboard Brilliant just how much they resented what had happened to them. But what he had just heard was a command. He had no choice but to respond. It was worrying that Pearce had called to him while standing next to the big Irish bruiser. In his young mind all sorts of threats manifested themselves in the few seconds he took to cross the deck. "Mr. Fairmelow, I know you were a member of the party who pressed O'Hagan and I from the Pelican Tavern."
"I was obeying Captain Barclay's orders, sir."
"I was just about to say, and I think I can speak for the others, that we are aware of that. We hold no resentment to you personally. Am I right, Michael?"
"Sure, he's only a strip of a lad, John boy."
Fairmelow tried and failed to hide his surprise at that familiarity, yet it registered one salient fact, that these men were still a close-knit group, and one he would do well to be careful with. "So, Mr. Fairmelow," Pearce continued, "you have no need to be evasive. We are to serve together, and if I have learnt anything in the limited time I have been afloat, it is best to be civil rather than fractious."
"Thank you, sir."
"So you can sleep easy in your berth." Fairmelow touched his hat and went back to his precious position.
"Well said, John boy, and necessary."
"Tell the others to treat him with respect, Michael. It will sound better coming from you."
"This court-martial, when is it to be?"
"When we return here. They cannot have it without we are present, and the fact has been taken down in the presence of Admiral Hotham's secretary. So, instead of sitting around fretting, I am happy to go on what is set to be an uneventful cruise."
"Flag signalling, sir!"
shouted Harbin.
"Captain to repair aboard!"
"Orders at last," said Digby minutes later, as he went over the side.